It's the Fintech Week is a really fantastic conference, so congratulations for putting it together. Well, I guess it's fair to say that CBDC is not in a way not a new issue. I mean, if you want to take a lot of steps back, it's only another step in the central bank technological journey, which has led us from papyrus to paper, and then from paper to plastic, etc. And central banks have been embracing innovation from the start, and it's only a new step they're taking. And it's also fair to say that some central banks have blazed the trail, and that was mentioned in the presentation a few minutes ago. And certainly the Riksbank is part of them, and People's Bank of China also is part of them. And they've been in many ways leading the way. And what we're seeing today is still a turning point, I would say, in terms of central banks' approaches to CBDC. And I would really describe 2020 as the moment where central banks have moved from research to action. There has been a lot of academic research on CBDC, a lot of conceptual discussion, and now it's time to move to experiments and building proofs of concept and testing the building blocks of CBDC. The next step would be to decide on a CBDC, which in many ways has to be a political decision for each and every central bank to take after consultation, after consulting the public, after consulting parliaments, governments, etc. But we are at exactly at the step before that, which is going into the real life and testing the different building blocks. At the BIS we ran a survey earlier this year, and we found that out of all central banks in the world, 80% were studying CBDC, 80%, which is up from last year. 40% are running proofs of concepts or prototypes, and 10% are doing pilot experiments, just like the PBOC is currently doing in Shenzhen. So it tells you a lot that we are really moving now to action. And maybe one last point worth noticing is that there is a lot of willingness to do it together. That is, there won't be one single CBDC. All CBDCs will be different. Because financial structures are different, preferences towards cash are different, central bank mandates are different, but there is a lot of willingness and an appetite to at least to investigate together and to identify which kind of requirements or common features and common principles are good for the system, as a system, for the international monetary system to work smoothly. And that's really the essence of the report, which was published a couple of weeks ago by 7 central banks at the BIS. It's about laying the foundations and making sure that whatever we do will not add to fragmentation in the system.
Well, Governor Skingsley, you were just referenced, and a lot of the work you were doing. What are you seeing in terms of the development of designing proofs of concept? And more specifically, what does that process look like from the inside? And what are you seeing as some of the primary barriers, both from an administrative standpoint, but also from a technical standpoint?
Well, thank you, and good morning to you all from Stockholm. So, yeah, we started launching this research project about 4 years ago. I gave a speech about it. And back then, there weren't many of us interested in this issue. And our starting point was the rapid dissension of usage of cash in the Swedish society. So we thought it was prudent from the central bank to bring up a discussion with ourselves, but also with the central banking community and society as a whole. How do we actually want these things to be organized? And money is not only about technology, it's also about policy, and it's about legislation. So it's a very intricate subject, and it really sort of strikes to the core of what a state is really about and what it offers to its citizens. And as technology now flips and people adapt to new changes, we on the public side has to come along in this development and offer, as Benoit pointed out, continue our historic role and continue to offer our services in a way that is adapted to what people are using in terms of technology in our time in history. So you said ask barriers. I would have to say that I don't see technological barriers in this area, but I do see technological challenges. And the challenge is not so much technology in itself, but it's more about we have to choose what sort of policy objectives do we want to focus on? What is the problem we want to solve? And depending on what that is and the purposes we want to serve, then you choose the technology after that. And the proof of concept we are working with is not mainly a technology issue we're talking about. It's more about the features and the services that we want this e-chrome now to have. And you can make many different choices here and choose many different models. And that's what we're doing at the moment.
And just so that I understand there, when those technology choices come along, it's usually through is it usually through some kind of technology provider or questions as to what you want to build out in-house?
So the way we have designed the pilot project currently is that we are doing this in cooperation with a company, Accenture. And because we think we'd be able to kind of jump a couple of steps forward if we get some of this knowledge from the outside rather than from the inside. But there are a number of things that you can only, knowledges that you can only keep within the central bank. If you think about 300 years ago when paper technology created basically notes, you had to be very quiet about the specific features in order to make them safe. And it's a similar way things develop now, that you can use sort of external or outside competence, but some things you have to keep to yourself. And I think one of the intricate issues in this is what sort of model you want to have, because different models can serve different needs. So if we want, for example, a CBDC that strengthens innovation and competition in the private sector, we should probably go for a more decentralized model. But we, on the other hand, wants to focus the CBDC more on serving resilience, that like it works more like a backstop when all other system fails. A central bank digital currency should still be standing. Then you have to go for a more centralized model where the dependence on private intermediaries are less of a circumstance. So there are many interesting choices to handle going forward.
That's really interesting. Mr. Cunliffe, I mean, do you see sort of when you look at the basic models and design choices, is that more or less the kind of, for lack of a better word, risk-reward trade-off that you're looking at, sort of the innovation versus resilience, and then tying that to, the degree of centralization? Or is there another perspective that you're taking when you're looking at a potential CBDC, and what are the kinds of models that are interesting you?
Well, first, I just emphasize the point that Cecilia made. It's important to look at this from what problem you're trying to solve and what problems you're trying to avoid. I think for us, we put out the Bank of England put out a consultation document in February. The problem we're trying to solve is the fact that physical cash is no longer convenient. It's becoming increasingly inconvenient for people to use in their everyday lives, and the COVID crisis has accelerated that. And on the other hand, it's becoming increasingly less acceptable to merchants for some of the same reasons, even merchants that are able to take physical cash. And if that's the problem you're trying to solve, then I think that leads you to a general purpose retail CBDC. It also leads you to decisions like, do you want a model that interacts freely with other forms of money? We have a number of different forms of money that operate in our economies at the moment. That's one of the ways you get competition. It's one of the ways you get innovation. So if you want a general purpose CBDC that operates alongside other forms of money and that encourages competition and innovation. It leads you down the route of a central bank providing infrastructure, but on the other hand, allowing the private sector to use that infrastructure to innovate and ensuring that all of the private sector operate on the same basis. In our consultation document, we put out a particular model. We did that not because we've chosen a particular model. Indeed, we haven't made a decision yet whether we want to implement a CBDC. And as has been said, that's not just a choice for technocrats. That's a choice for society and for the political side as well. But we put out a model because we thought this can appear a theoretical subject to people or blue sky thinking. And when you put something out there, then you get a much stronger response when people look at it and can see what it could do. And I think very important for us in that model was the concept of ensuring interoperability, innovation, competition, but on the other hand, also ensuring that people did continue to have access to basically state money in the form of a central bank currency. You then face a number of trade-offs. I mean, people watching, if they haven't already read it, there's an interesting report from a group of 7 central banks and the Bank for International Settlements that we put out last week. Benoit, Cecilia, and I were some of those involved in it, which then set out some of the trade-offs that you face when you try and deliver the objectives that you have. There's the trade-off between usability and convenience and security. There's the trade-off between privacy and law enforcement. There are a number of trade-offs, and then you have to make those choices in the technology. But the key thing is, before one dives into, do you want a ledger or do you want a token? And I think, Chris, you're putting forward a digitalized dollar that's a token. Our consultation document had a ledger-based system. But before you dive into all of that, the key point is to establish what are you actually trying to achieve, and crucially, what are you actually trying to avoid as well in terms of the risks.
You know, what I've been struck by thus far is that the origins for many of the conversations, certainly on the other side of the pond, are driven by this question about cash and the disappearance of cash. But Chris, Giancarlo, you and I speak very often and very frequently about these things, and you're certainly the leading voice really about many of the issues of a digital dollar, or the prospects thereof in the United States. How do you see the drivers of that conversation here in terms of how they compare elsewhere from the work that you're doing over at the Digital Dollar Foundation and elsewhere? And how does that inform what you consider to be some of the models and choices facing folks a little bit in my neck of the woods here in Washington?
Thanks, Chris. And it's great to be with Benoit and with John and Cecilia. We follow their work very, very closely, and the thoughtfulness they bring from it and the global perspective they bring is very important. As we at the Digital Dollar Foundation, in our partnership with Accenture and the Digital Dollar Project, think about what a future CBDC might mean for the United States dollar. And our focus is relatively narrow in that regard because we are focused on the dollar and its role. And as we think about that, in our white paper, we put forward what we call our champion model, which has a number of elements, as John noted, is token-based, not accounts-based. It's distributed through the existing 2-tiered banking system. And at heart, we believe that its form should follow function. And just as John and Cecilia said, you have to ask yourself, what do you want to achieve? And then I think a lot of the functionality and the design choices come from that. And there are many design choices. There's no perfect one. Everyone has a balancing aspect. But at heart, when we stopped and spent time thinking about the dollar, we really came down to a set of values that we think are embedded in the dollar in its current role as a global reserve currency. And we think making sure those values are embedded in a digital form of the dollar, a digital dollar, a US CBDC, is critically important. So what are those values that we seek to enhance and preserve and improve for a generation to come? Well, we think about things like proper balance of privacy against law enforcement needs of the state. We think about the rule of law. We think about free enterprise and free capital markets freed of state interference. And we think about the attributes that we believe are embedded in the dollar that have made it the premier world reserve currency. And as it's different states, both democracies and non-democracies, start rolling out elements of digital currency, we think other values may be embedded in them. State surveillance, as was noted in an earlier video, or interference in markets. And so we think ultimately when you design a central bank digital currency, making sure you embed in it functionally the values that a society holds dear are critically important. And so as we've been spending a lot of time thinking about this, we think ultimately we come down to it's about value choices. And as we look at each little design element, how do those value choices play out in those design elements are something we spend a lot of time thinking about.
One of the most interesting things, Benoit, when you think about the history of the BIS, it's something that I tell my own students when I teach them, is just how much that institution has adapted over time and evolved with the very concept of money. From gold to fiat currencies. I mean, the Basel or the Bank for International Settlements has evolved along with the monetary system, and as its own sort of prominence in international monetary relations has risen, it's had to navigate the fact that countries actually do have different values. And they do have different kinds of priorities, and they lie on different sort of points in economic development and the like. And here, when I'm listening to Giancarlo speak and Cecilia, you're hearing about values and priorities, and thinking to yourself, well, what is the problem you're trying to solve? And when you're asking yourself about problems, what's your perspective about what a problem is? So you can ultimately certainly foresee a world of different kinds of CBDCs, in part reflecting different kinds of national values. And here the BIS is going to sit at the middle of it all, trying to think about questions that you're grappling with of interoperability and how exactly would a world of multiple CBDCs sort of operate from both the standpoints of financial stability and from a monetary perspective. I mean, how do you go about thinking about interoperability, even where you may not know the very specifics as to the designs of any sort of CBDC that may be in the making?
So it's clearly not an easy question you're asking, but let me first say that I fully concur with Chris and with you when you say that that CBDC will be a matter of national preferences. It will be a matter of national taste, and there will be different CBDCs, and that's because it's fundamentally a sovereign decision, which is also why some of the concerns we can hear about the international spillovers of CBDC are, in my view, a little bit overblown, because CBDC projects are primarily for domestic purpose. Parliaments are not very excited by international matters usually. They really focused on what is good for their citizens, and rightly so. So these are fundamentally domestic projects. And so you might ask, why is the BIS role there? And if CBDC is a matter of national taste, why should central banks work together, right? Well, first, they can pool resources, and that can save a lot of time. And that's a little bit what we've started to do in this report, which we've been mentioning, trying to work together to advance faster. And that's exactly what the BIS Innovation Hub is meant to do, pooling resources, to have joint experiments, so that you don't have to duplicate resources, and you can move faster. And second, there are issues related to the way the system works as a system. And I think we all agree that the well-functioning international monetary system and international financial system is key for global prosperity. It's key for growth. And that's where interoperability kicks in. Now, interoperability is a little bit of a catch-all word. I mean, it can mean different things. It could mean that platforms, CBDC platforms in different countries are connected. It could mean that CBDC platforms are built on common standards so that private operators, private players can access them. And that's very important because, as Cecilia rightly said, we need private players, we need payment service providers to be active using CBDC and connecting different places nationally and internationally. And that could also mean that end users could use multiple CBDCs in the same wallet, for instance. So these are different meanings for the same word, which is interoperability, and there are different technical answers. And that can also mean that countries' jurisdictions will be connected through their traditional payment system, RTGS systems. And if you have a good way to connect different RTGS systems in different places, and then CBDC is settled in the RTGS system, that's also a nice way to interconnect CBDCs. So you see there are different ways to do it. And that's why the discussion on CBDC is very, very closely linked to the broader discussion on cross-border payments, which John is leading for the G20 under the G20 action plan. It's one part of this broader discussion on cross-border payments.
Yeah, just that in and of itself, you know, from being in the United States where we have sort of parallel conversations going on in terms of our RTGS systems, not to mention sort of larger conversations on a CBDC, it makes that kind of balancing act really interesting. And I think we may return to that shortly. But you know, when you talk about interoperability, Cecilia, and you think about, well, let's talk about a more ambitious form of interoperability. You may, I'm sure, be familiar with some of the concerns people have about CBDCs, particularly from countries that have very large GDPs on a global basis, and the relationship of a CBDC vis-a-vis other kinds of countries, particularly about the transmission of monetary policy internationally. And then there are some real concerns that CBDCs could create not only monetary problems, but also sort of either political or financial ones, to the extent to which money creation is effectively shifted entirely to central banks from the commercial banks. Is this something that's kind of come across your radar? Do you think that these concerns are overblown? And from a policy standpoint, how do you go about kicking the tires, if that's the right metaphor, of a CBDC project to help diminish both the risks that are perceived and the concerns?
Well, there were a number of questions in that question, but let me start with the saying yes. We have all these questions. I've spent several rounds around the globe before the pandemic hit us all, discussing this issue. So I'm familiar with them, and they're all very good questions. And if I start with the national arena. And this idea of a CBDC sort of taking over everything and would harm the banking system. But first of all, we have to remember history here, that central bank money in the form of cash and commercial bank money in the form of accounts have been working side by side for the best part of 150 years. So this is not a new thing. This is just technology changing, and we have to make decisions on how to adopt to that technology change. And over time, deposit money has become more and more available as making payments. And one of the ideas from the report that Benoit and John chaired that we talked about, and it was launched just recently, is the sort of the do no harm principle, that we need to meet our historical role, making payments safe and efficient, but also meet our other objectives, which is financial stability and monetary stability. That's why we are conducting monetary policy. Now, as technology changes and the sort of the national borders here becomes a bit more blurry in this area, I think it's important to remember that, first of all, money is a competitive industry. I mean, if you look at history, it's really something attractive to have the rights to issue money. It's like an endless loan where you pay no interest. So of course it's attractive, and that's why governments sort of traditionally regulated it. On the other hand, the payments, but you can't, sometimes when people talk about CBDC, they only talk about CBDC, but you can't really talk about it without talking about the whole system, and money and making payments are, they're very intricate. And the payment system is, you might think it is also competitive, but if you think about it, it's actually not a very competitive market at all. It has strong network effects. So just for instance, most people doesn't carry around one card for each shop they go in. They use one or two, and that's why we have MasterCard and Visa and the likes that are global players. So when you think about CBDC, and you get the question, I get the question, what is the purpose? You can try flipping the question and say instead, what is the situation that we don't like and the CBDC could help us to avoid? Well, it would help us, depending on the sign again, it could help us to avoid a number of unpleasant situations. And one is that small countries, such as my own, sort of lose control over what I would like to call the monetary sovereignty of a country, meaning that if other countries are making more efficient, more up to sort of leveled up the game with and take over, you can get something which has been called a digital dollarization of countries, which a number of countries wouldn't like to have. And that brings me into my last comment about this, which is how do you design the system on a global scale? And that's hard, and I think some countries, and it doesn't necessarily have to be advanced economies. I find it much more plausible that there will be smaller countries which really have financial inclusion problems, that they will start this, because they don't really stand to lose as much as big advanced economies if things goes and you have to adjust the system a little bit on the way. And then other countries will learn from that and pick up, and there will be national deviations, but along the line we will sort of put the systems together, and more countries will probably latch onto it. And I think in about sort of 50, 100 years from now, people will go back to debates like this and said they were really worried about a number of things. They were worried about the wrong things, but I think I'm optimistic that we will get there in the end.
So there's a very famous clip in the United States when Bill Gates was first trying to describe the internet to a very famous comedian, David Letterman. So I guess you're sort of saying we'll have this, maybe they'll be looking at this clip and saying, wow, there are many people very concerned about CBDCs. Well, John, I mean, do you have, or do you share that kind of optimism, particularly, when you look at the transmission of monetary policy and the relationship to sort of how the introduction of a CBDC could impact lending with domestic banks. I've heard certainly from many financial institutions and many banks who, where people have expressed some concern that it can not only impact their business, but really sort of shift lending and the money creation role out of the commercial banks and sort of move the balance of power to central banks. Is this something that you've thought about as a realistic concern, or is it just sort of an overhyped concern? And especially when you think back and you get back to your original sort of driver, which is the disappearance of cash, right? So if you start to see a disappearance of cash, and you see the introduction of a CBDC, and then depending on the design features of that CBDC, if you see more of the sort of literally financial power migrating to the central bank, is this a kind of a disaster scenario, or is this something that warrants considerable thought?
So I think I'd say it's a real issue, but you shouldn't blow it out of proportion. I mean, what we've been talking about, as you say, is a retail payments-based CBDC, not a CBDC for monetary policy purposes, and also a CBDC that would exist with other forms of money, commercial bank money, maybe private sector digital money, properly regulated. And I know you had a discussion earlier on about stablecoin. The key thing is we don't know the behavioural response of people to a central bank retail currency, digital currency. We don't know whether they'll want to keep all of the money they currently keep in commercial bank deposits for transactional purposes in it, or whether they'll want to keep some in it and maintain their normal retail accounts. It's possible that you might need features within a CBDC, going back to that foundational principle of the report. A number of people have mentioned do no harm, and do no harm to monetary stability and financial stability. It might be that you will need some features, to ensure that it wouldn't destabilize or cause problems for the monetary policy transmission mechanism. But at the moment, I don't see that as necessarily the main danger, or potentially a likely danger. And on this question of financial stability, a number of people have alluded to the problem you might have with bank runs. People could run very quickly to a digital central bank currency, or even just the disintermediation of the banking system more generally. Again, I think we live with those issues now. I mean, we live with those issues in terms of physical cash. We have mechanisms to prevent bank runs and to deal with them when they occur. It may be that a CBDC, will need some additional features to deal with that, and that might mean restrictions. But actually, in the UK, certainly, if you walk into your bank with a huge amount of cash and want to deposit it, you might find there are some restrictions. And if you want to make a very large payment, even as a central banker, you get asked some fairly probing questions. So we live with restrictions, and some would say controls, on the way we use money now. I don't think it's impossible to design a CBDC that wouldn't be able to deal with that. And I think that just say that the issue is, again, to start with what you want to achieve and then see how you deliver the do no harm, rather than start with the things it might do. And it may be we have to start small, and as we learn about the behavioural response of people to having this asset, to go further. If I can make just one last point, talked about the balance of power between central banks and commercial banks, which obviously we're all fascinated by. But it's not that long ago, and actually I could even remember it, when if I wanted to use a credit card, somebody rolled a roller over a piece of paper with 4 sheets of carbon to do that. And I couldn't use a credit card to buy my coffee. And sometimes I couldn't use a cheque below £30, which was a much higher value in those days than it is today. The balance of power, if you like, what we see now in the use of commercial bank money in everyday life is just a huge shift that's occurred over the last 25 years. And these things move backwards and forwards. The book of Genesis didn't have within it a division between central banks and commercial banks. It evolves with technology, and it will continue to evolve. We have to ensure it evolves in a way that meets our public policy objectives.
Well, I can say that you have now thoroughly done something that I had not anticipated, which was introducing theology into the central bank digital currency debate. Chris, I think that Giancarlo, I think that one of the interesting conversations here, I mean, the United States, the way in which we sort of oversee our financial system, our monetary system is quite interesting, because we have obviously the Fed board, and then we have the regional banks. And then even added to that, we have a very active and a very large sort of banking system. even as chairman of the CFTC, you had talked a good deal about what an ideal sort of interaction would be in order to tackle some of the design questions, even once the government sort of creates or articulates what kind of values it would have. We were talking to Mark Branson, who had laid out sort of how he thinks about that kind of coordination between, in the case of the lbry Association, but also other cryptocurrency founders and technologists, sort of the ideal relationship between the state and different sort of cryptocurrency actors. When it comes to the CBDC question, how do you see that playing out in an American context in a more fragmented monetary system?
We talked about values, and John actually talked about the book Genesis, and that comes back to what I began the conversation with, and that is that, how does society enshrine its social values into its money? And in fact, another conversation I had with John not too long ago, he said to me, it seems like every several generations, society asks the same question again: what is money? And I think we're at one of those points in time because of this new technological revolution in terms of the internet of value and the digitization of things of value, that we're once again asking the question, what is money? And it's not just central banks that are asking the question. Society at large is asking the question. In fact, we can think back 10 years, it was really Bitcoin that really started us down this road. And then it was other things like the pandemic, like China, and like lbry coin that have gotten all of us. And so I think there's a broad conversation going on right now that's not confined to the official sector. I think it's very much an official sector, public sector conversation. And so one of the things we're trying to do in the States at the Digital Dollar Project is bring together the conversations that are taking place in the official sector and the work that's being done in the private sector so they can benefit from each other. And in fact, that approach is consistent with the American tradition of the way we explored the lunar surface. It's consistent with the way the internet was developed with the DoD and DERPA, but also with the private sector actively involved in the development of the internet. And I think that as the United States goes forward in looking at a central bank digital currency, it's going to engage more directly with the private sector. And we at the Digital Dollar Project just last week put forward our proposals for a series of pilot programs that we think can explore both the retail use of this, but also wholesale use of this in different use cases. And I commend your viewers to take a look at that. It's on our website, digitaldollarproject.org. And we ourselves at the Digital Dollar Project in the next few weeks will be announcing a project that we're going to work on to start experimentation in this area. And we've been engaged with the official sector throughout, with the Federal Reserve Bank and with Treasury and other government agencies, because we want to really see this very rich communication between the private sector and the public sector. And I'll just end on this note. I mentioned that's a U.S. tradition, but if you look around the world, that's what's happening in most of the other projects as well. Certainly China is engaged very much with its commercial actors in the development of their DEP. And I think that that's very much the way that this will continue to develop in the United States.
Yeah, we only have a couple of minutes, but Chris brought up the big issue out there with China and particularly with their involvement with their CBDC project. Very, very briefly, I would like to get each of your sort of your opinions about whether or not, number one, how do you view this project in terms of how advanced it seems, and then what do you think it's doing to the conversation on CBDCs domestically for other countries that are looking about their own values and also thinking through what kind of money and monetary system they would like to have? We'll go in reverse order this time. Since you brought it up, Giancarlo, we'll start with you.
Well, I actually think that if you categorize, as you often see in the press, the development of CBDC as a race, then they'll often talk about China's advanced start and obviously Sweden as well, but they've defined it in terms of who goes first. I actually think that's the wrong way to look at this. I don't think if there's a winner, I don't think the winner is necessarily who's first and the loser is necessarily who's last. What matters is which central bank successfully incorporates its societal values in a successful development of CDBC. So it's not a question of going first, not a question of going last, but it's a question of success in making sure that a CBDC has those values associated with it. And that's our focus in the US. Now, on the other hand, one can't be too late to the game here. And that's why we very much advocate that, at least in the US context, that the United States really get in the game and get active in the game in a way that it is increasingly, but perhaps it wasn't as much 6 months ago. So we're very pleased to see the United States accelerate its work in this because of interoperability. The last thing the world needs is for the United States to not be engaged and then wake up 3 years from now and suddenly say, oh, we are going to engage. And oh, by the way, we want to go in a different technological direction. We're going to not be concerned with some of the interoperability aspects. So the United States needs to be engaged now, but ultimately it's about incorporating those values into a successful deployment of CBDC.
Cecilia, China, 30 seconds.
I think it's just a very excellent example of how a digitalized economy makes us all have to ask how we serve societal needs in the best possible way. This is digitalization that changes people's behaviors, changing the landscape of the monetary system. China seemed to be on the forefront. We also have to do our homework in terms of cash disappearing rapidly. And we're just going to have to carry on. And it's going to have to be quite a rebuilding of the infrastructure and a little bit of a change between public influence and private sector influence before we get it where we want it to be.
John?
Yeah, so first of all, I agree entirely with Chris that the wrong way to look at this is to feel this is some form of race. And the Chinese actually were the first, I think, with paper money, so maybe they'll be the first with a digital currency. The key is whether you can meet your societal needs and your economic needs and find a way to reflect that. And I think given the way the world is, and national jurisdictions operate, this will be first and foremost a set of domestic issues. Where we have a real opportunity, though, is unlike other periods of change in money and development of national infrastructure for payments, we actually have the opportunity now to ensure that we don't build in unintended barriers to interoperability in all the forms that Benoit discussed. And where we choose to limit interoperability, that's an actual choice we make, rather than, as what's happened in the past, our systems have evolved, and it's just been very difficult to achieve some of the gains we could get through managed and responsible interoperability. So I really think we have an opportunity, but you start from how do you deal with the needs in your own society and your own economy while trying to be aware of what you do to make sure you retain the optionality on interoperability.
Well, our time is up, but I'll let Benoit have the very last word.
Well, I would also agree that it's not a matter of competition with China. So if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you want to pick a fight with China, you can pick a fight on CBDC, but it's not about CBDC. It's something different. And when we discuss international cooperation over CBDC at the BIS in Basel, PBOC is very much part of it. And we have a very good and intense discussions and relations with CBDC. And when you look at the DCEP project in China, it's primarily a domestic project. It's not a geopolitical project. And the way I would say it is that they have these big tech players which are becoming fintech players or big tech in finance with huge networks, and they want to be on top of it. The authorities want to remain on top of it, and authorities want to be sure that digital currency, whichever way it is being done, serves public objectives in China. And that it's the same conversation everywhere. The objectives might be different, obviously, but the kind of conversation will be the same everywhere. And so there are lots of lessons to learn from their experience.
Well, thank you so very, very much. I mean, that topic in and of itself, I know is a big one when against the backdrop of the internationalization of the yuan and the like, but thank you so very much. This kind of conversation is vital. It's necessary, and just having you here for our audience is what DC Fintech Week is about, and I appreciate all of your time to come. You have been wonderful, both on camera and off with me, and I just wanted to thank you again for making the time. And I guess we will now be switching to our next panel. But before we do, we're about to make this jump now from CBDCs to non-governmental currencies and what they mean for the market. But before we do, I want to introduce our poll for the day. So shout out to Chainalysis for the sport. The question is, for the audience, what, if anything, is stopping you from investing in cryptocurrency? Not CBDC, in cryptocurrency. And you can go to slido.com to input your opinion with the code DC Fintech. And we will, again, DC FINTECH, and we'll provide the results for those who do. And with this audience, I'm pretty sure there will be more than a little curiosity. And with that, we are going to continue our conversation with one of the big draws of the day, Brad Garlinghouse. Now, Brad is, as many of our viewers know, the CEO of Ripple, and he is an alum of DC Fintech Week, where he wowed the audience in 2019 and was very, very popular. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to get his views on not only our earlier conversation on CBDCs, but also the evolving regulatory environment more generally for cryptocurrencies and for blockchain projects. Brad, thank you so much for coming back.
Chris, it is great to be here again. The two quick short comments. One is I'm amazed every year. You guys do such a great job. That last panel, I think, was indicative of the caliber of people and the caliber of conversation. So congrats. The second thing I think it's worth noting, it is good to see you again. It's been a year. And in some ways, I think it's just interesting to think about how much has changed in that year. And in some ways, as I think we'll probably discuss in our discussion today, it's amazing in some ways how little has changed. And I particularly think about some of the regulatory stuff here in the United States when I say that. But it's great to be back. Great to see you again. And thanks for hosting me.
Well, this is great. Well, I think you're already kicking off a good sort of line of conversation. I mean, a year ago, when we were here in Washington, D.C., we were talking a little bit about Ripple's move to our nation's capital. And as you said, there's certainly been a lot that has changed. And then there's obviously been a good deal that hasn't. Obviously, the coronavirus has impacted everyone here in the city and around the world. But besides sort of that particular exogenous event, I mean, what have you learned and seen about Washington? You're getting to the regulatory issues that you may not have either learned or known or fully appreciated, and what has sort of struck you to be the most sort of memorable aspect of this last year?
That's to get that last part kind of caught me thinking the most memorable aspect. I might have to think on that for a minute, but the thing I probably learned, I think Silicon Valley in general has had a deserved reputation of being kind of late and engaging in Washington. And I think in some ways, the crypto community in Washington, hasn't been as active. And I think as we, Ripple, certainly have gotten more active, I've definitely learned some things. And in some ways, I've learned that the U.S., from a regulatory point of view and from a legislative point of view, is very open to new technologies, is very open to how these technologies can be applied to benefit real people. Not just the trading, not just the speculation, but actually how do we apply these in a way that actually can benefit people? And certainly that's been true for Ripple. I've also, I suppose, to be fair and maybe a little glass half empty, the wheels of legislative process and even regulatory process move quite slowly. And, it's been 2.5 years since, Bitcoin was declared not a security and Ether was declared not a security. And yet, other than, some enforcement actions on the, more, I'll call abusive side, we still have a lack of clarity. And there's lots of examples of that we can talk about.
Yeah, just from a culture standpoint, certainly, I guess we haven't been traveling quite as much as we used to. But is there something that you see in terms of just the cultural makeup and backup of the two cities that has been interesting when it comes to how one talks about cryptocurrencies, CBDCs, blockchain infrastructures, and the like? I've always made the joke that when it comes to crypto, Silicon Valley makes it, New York trades it, and DC regulates it, and they all have problems sort of talking to one another. I mean, is there something about it that you've seen, and it plays itself out either in the regulatory process or in California out when it comes to the market sort of design process?
Look, I've been, over the course of the last year, in the last couple of years, I've been kind of outspoken on some of these points. I've been in Silicon Valley for 20 plus years, and I've been, I think, part of the fabric of the evolution of the internet. And it's interesting to me sometimes that the Silicon Valley community sometimes I don't think fully appreciates some of the things it could do better. Expressions like move fast and break stuff. Or even Uber's approach at times, I don't find that to be as constructive as it could be. And I think that has informed, that has created a culture at Ripple of, we have very specifically tried not to be, quote, disruptors, but rather, how do we be constructive? How do we work with the system? How do we work with regulators? And that has really paid dividends for us in many countries around the world. And I think that we have seen an incredibly positive reaction, incredibly positive engagement from regulators around the world. But as we've already talked about, in the US, I think it was last week or the week before, the Department of Justice put out a 70+ page paper about some dynamics in crypto. And in the document, it references 8 different groups within the U.S. government that have some sort of opinion about, how crypto should be viewed, how crypto should be regulated. And, the challenge is for companies operating here in the United States, it's really hard to know. You can't have regulation. It's a guessing game. We Ripple take it very seriously. We take the KYC requirements, BSA requirements, AML requirements very seriously. But when regulation is a guessing game and you have different parts of the government saying different things, that makes it really hard to operate here in the United States. We've, I suppose, made some headlines over the course of the last week, about should we continue to be based, should Ripple, the company, continue to be based here in the United States?
I was about to get into that. Yeah, exactly.
And look, I'm a U.S. citizen. I grew up in Kansas. Ripple's a proud U.S. company for sure. But we find ourselves in this situation where it's not a level playing field for what Ripple is doing in the XRP community is doing. It's really not a level playing field, and that I have to think about that implication for the company.
Okay, so let's sort of think a little bit more concretely about that and sort of the international dimensions of whenever you're working in digital finance is very often a cross-border business, right? You have people either moving money from one country to the other. Sometimes talent can be distributed across different kinds of locations. And so business plans are inherently, international, something that we've already talked about at length earlier today. Maybe you could just sort of walk us through a little bit from your seat at the top of Ripple, what that looks like in practice. I mean, you had made some very interesting remarks about China. We talked about China with our earlier leaders panel from government, and you had noted not just the regulatory sort of challenge in the United States in terms of there being a very sort of heterogeneous sort of mixture of regulators, but you were also noting from a technology standpoint just how advanced some countries were becoming, especially as it turns or as it relates to crypto. What does that mean for a company like yours that's working really at the sort of cutting edge of digital finance? I mean, what does it mean in terms of the friction and the choices that not just Ripple, but really any company that's dynamic has when trying to decide where to do business, how to do business, and what kind of cost reward trade-off is in that mix?
Right. So I think, like any investment, you think about how do I maximize potential upside, but minimize risk. And I think that when you have certainty and you know how to invest, then that minimizes some level of risk. Your earlier panel was talking a lot about China. I loved the Book of Genesis reference. The way I think about the China dynamic, it's not that I disagreed with the panelists, it's that I think about it a little bit more broadly. It's not just about CBDCs. When I think about this, China has been incredibly strategic. When they look at crypto and they look at blockchain, they've been very strategic. Premier Xi has actually come out and said, blockchain investment is, a critical priority. And, they have made huge progress on the CBDC, just airdropping 10 million of their digital yuan to citizens in Shenzhen. It's like they are making real progress here. And I know that the previous panel, I think fairly kind of says, well, look, it's not really about who's first. It's about how does it mesh well. But we got to also remember, it's not just what China has been doing to the CBDC. Today we sometimes gloss over the fact that there is risk, and we talk about centralized and decentralized in these various technologies. Bitcoin mining is 65 to 75% controlled by Chinese miners. And I think it's hard not to argue that the Chinese Communist Party does not have the opportunity to have control there. I'll take kind of I suppose, alarmist point of view, but what happens if Premier Xi loses $1 million in Bitcoin? You don't think that the Chinese Communist Party has the opportunity to affect a change to the Bitcoin blockchain and make a reverse Premier Xi's $1 million loss of Bitcoin that might have been hacked? So I think that's true for Bitcoin, that's true for ETH. That's of course leaving aside the massive energy dynamics and pollution dynamics that we see with Bitcoin and ETH. But it's concerning to me that we here in the United States have given those technologies an advantage. And it goes back to what you're asking about. Just last week, I was speaking with a developer here in San Francisco, and he was talking about investing and building upon ETH as a development platform. And one of the reasons he cited is, look, there's certainty and clarity about the regulation around ETH. So would I invest in or build upon a different stack when there's not certainty? That's a real issue. And I think you see governments like the UK, like Singapore, like Japan, the UAE, or even Switzerland. These are all really good examples where regulation has provided the clarity of the regulation has provided the ability for a healthy market to develop in a holistic view. And that I think helps, companies like Ripple, companies that, want to invest in this space.
So, when you think about the amount of development in crypto, I think that a lot of people, when it comes to national competitiveness, will think, well, one country, this is a new technology, so the barriers to entry are low enough that perhaps it's, countries can play catch up. Better than almost anyone, what it takes to be a cutting edge actor in this space. When you think about sort of the competition within, again, not just CBDC, but really crypto and even blockchain writ large, and supporting softwares and digital infrastructures, I mean, how accurate is that? How easy or hard is it for an entrant to play catch up and to be competitive, what does that usually take?
I think it's a really important and good question. I think it kind of, as came up in your earlier panel in the context of, is it important to be first or important to get it right? And where there are not network effects, where there are not kind of effects that are kind of the flywheel, then I totally agree that whether you're first, whether you're second, whether you're 10th, the ability to play catch up, I think, no big deal. There are dynamics, though, that kind of what I'll loosely call network effects, where the liquidity of an asset, right? So the fact that Bitcoin is the most liquid digital asset is a good thing. And once you have that, that's that's helpful to the Bitcoin community. Look, by the way, as much as I get accused of being, anti-Bitcoin, I own Bitcoin. I'm bullish on Bitcoin for sure. So I think that it's important to understand that those advantages that can start because of an uneven playing field, it's not just, okay, now we're going to level the playing field and it's going to reset to normal. The longer those advantages are in place, the more the competitive dynamics and almost the moats are created. And I think that's hard to overcome. And I think that's where I think China is looking at a very long, not just a decade out, but maybe a century out, and making sure that, look, these underlying technologies really are going to be the underpinnings of the internet of value. And it's going to change the way transactions around cross-border money movement works, certainly where Ripple is focused, but it's going to change how other transactions work as well. And I think China is being very smart and very strategic by investing in this and by having a very significant stake in it. And I think it's going to be a challenge just to, hey, the U.S. now has a level playing field with these other technologies. And I'm not even just talking about, how that benefits the XRP community, but others that are doing interesting things that are being responsible players and working with regulators. That I think, all we're asking for is that level playing field.
It's really an interesting and important conversation. I mean, China is their approach is not only domestic, but they do have and have thought about how do you create sort of a digital infrastructure overseas. There's been a longstanding conversation about the internationalization of its currency, and it's interesting how those kinds of things intersect with how they build out their money. I mean, have you been struck by just how much in this last year, since we last talked at Fintech Week, how much that CBDC conversation has taken off, and what do developments in those pockets of the ecosystem mean for Ripple and for XRP?
Well, I have been impressed and frankly even surprised. I have commented publicly. I was at Davos World Economic Forum event this past February or January, I guess, in Davos. And I remember one of the first comments I got when I was there. I was walking down some stairs and a regulator from another country walked by. I was like, "Oh, nice to see you." And his comment to me was, crypto is still a bad word here. And I thought, that's interesting. I mean, it's a tough way to start the conference. But what's interesting is today, what we have seen and the conversations Ripple is having with various central banks around the world is about 70% of central banks are really looking seriously at this technology. And so I think that is indicative of how that world is changing. Now, that being said, that definitely, I think, is a constructive thing for Ripple and for the XRP community. Just having a central bank issued digital currency still does not solve the dynamic of needing to settle a transaction, settle a payment between the Argentinian peso and the Australian dollar. Having really simple transaction dynamics, both on the messaging and on the liquidity, is still critical to make that work to really enable the internet of value, we think about and we talk about. So I actually see it in some of the work we are doing with central banks around the world. I think it's a very positive dynamic. And look, I think it's still unclear to me exactly how central bank issued digital currencies, your last panel talked about this, what problems are they solving? Is it circumvention of some of the existing commercial banking infrastructure? How do those dynamics play out? Look, I don't know. What I do know is regardless of how that plays out, you still need a lot of, you need a neutral asset that doesn't carry that baggage as a central bank issued digital asset. And XRP as extremely efficient on the speed, extremely efficient on the cost per transaction, and the scalability is really well suited to help solve that, which is why Ripple has invested where we have.
Tying it together with your original question of the competitiveness of the United States and sort of business and strategic decisions that you have to make every day, and then against the backdrop of what has changed dramatically since we last talked, the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, how has the coronavirus pandemic, how has it impacted your business strategy, as the leader of Ripple, and what are you looking at, and what should we be looking at in the next 12 months from you?
Yeah. So look, I think there's no doubt the pandemic has impacted lots of parts of the economy, and certainly it has impacted Ripple. And in some ways, it's impacted us in a very, very positive way. And in some way, it's made our jobs harder. At the core, a big part of what Ripple does is, we sell financial technology. We sell that underlying kind of plumbing to financial institutions, banks, payment providers. And, that certainly, we've continued to sign up a lot of new customers, and still averaging kind of, about 2 a week, which is great. But, that is a little bit slower than we were at the beginning of the year in January. And, that is a lot because if you can't show up to the Bank of Chris and the Bank of, Fintech Week, or whatever we want to call it, that makes the sales process a little higher friction. Now, on the other hand, the dynamics of the pandemic have highlighted some of the huge gaps in our financial infrastructure. From moving from cash to digital, and I think it highlights how some of the unbanked and underbanked have been left behind by what's happening globally. And so that, coupled with massive inflation of fiat currencies, that's really good for the crypto industry at large. It's not at all a surprise to me to see that the broader crypto market overall, according to the sources I think you and I both looked at, it's up somewhere around 90% this year. And I'm pretty bullish about what the next year or 2 or 3 looks like for the crypto market at large. And that's largely because when you print as much fiat stimulus, fiat currencies as we're seeing globally, that will lead to inflation. It does devalue those fiat currencies. And so I think that you obviously gold doing very well, you see crypto doing very well, and I think that'll continue to be the case.
We only have a minute or 2 left, but I did want to, when we were talking about the different cultures of the East Coast and the West Coast, and you're talking about financial inclusion, one of the things that I did notice, and I've been, which certainly has caught my eye, is that Ripple's been a little bit ahead of the game, particularly when it comes to conversations on diversity, and actually called out pretty explicitly Ripple's intent to diversify its board. From people here on the East Coast, maybe in Washington, D.C. and in New York, this sounds a lot like something that's not just sort of morally justified, but pretty good business. But why, has it been harder, to have that conversation, culture-wise in Silicon Valley, and just wrapping things up? I mean, what made you feel like this was the right call and worth making sense when you're sitting here navigating CBDCs and cross-border payments and competitiveness of the United States and regulatory issues and the like?
Chris, I'm glad you asked about this. As I mentioned earlier, I've been out in this part of the world for 20 plus years. I've seen the tech community kind of go through a number of different undulations. And the thing I feel very strongly and kind of very deeply as I think about the Ripple culture is I think we have actually an obligation to lean in. I think we have an obligation to be a part of the solution for some of the macro problems we see. And, I think that the saddest part of that for me is I see tech companies that I think have, if not, well, at best, they've exacerbated some of those problems. And so we have, I think, from the origins of the company, tried to lean into that. One example I'll give real quickly, and I know we're running out of time here, is, we made a big announcement recently about going carbon neutral and making sure the XRP ledger is carbon neutral. And at the same time we're making those announcements, I find it interesting that Square is out there exclusively supporting Bitcoin, which again, I think let's remind ourselves, Bitcoin mining consumes 1% of global energy consumption. Wow. How can a company, and I think all of us at our corporate environments, I think Square should be thinking about what is the carbon footprint of that decision. Now, I happen to know that one of the reasons why Square looks at that way is because there is regulatory certainty about Bitcoin. And as we look at other companies looking at this space, they look at what is the regulatory certainty. And so it's ironic, in my opinion, the US has made decisions which are actually exacerbating things like global warming by virtue of supporting this heavily mining intensive stuff. Anyway, I know I'm a little bit off your core question. Suffice it to say, Ripple has and will continue to invest in making sure we have diversity at all levels of the company. We've been really fortunate to have some fantastic women on the board. We did join the recent pledge to add a person of color to the board of directors, and we are working on that very actively right now, and hope to have an announcement soon.
Well, congratulations, and thank you so very much for your time, Brad, both from last year and also showing up again this year. It's really interesting, and as always, I learned a lot.
Chris, thanks for having me again. Hope to see you again next year.
Absolutely.
My name is Marco Lairba. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Zurich and a fellow at New York University School of Law. This paper is Crypto Shadow Banking as part of a broader project on the transformative stages of capitalism. And the key question is whether crypto finance is leading to a revolution or an evolution. Shadow banking has contributed to the financial crisis of 2008. And after that, there was a regulatory reaction and a technological reaction. Focusing on the technological reaction, the creation and implementation of the blockchain system with Bitcoin and multiple transformations has led to the emergence of new financial networks that I identify as shadow central banking and crypto shadow banking. Now the question is whether shadow banking and crypto shadow banking have any similarities and what we can do from a policy perspective. Shadow banking is a network of financial institutions and financial instruments where assets, often illiquid, are spread to investors in the form of mortgage-backed securities, CDOs, repos, and securitizations because of the actions of institutional investors such as money market funds and pension funds acting as conduits. Looking at the causes of its establishment, we can see that there was a high quality collateral scarcity, and this was a major problem. The regulation of financial services and banking regulation contributed to enhance the establishment of shadow banking, and there was a downward pressure on regulated institutions from not regulated ones that could more easily and systematically implement financial engineering in their business models. This has led to the emergence of problems such as excessive leverage, conflict of interest and opacity, liquidity and counterparty risks, and too big to fail problems. Looking at crypto shadow banking now, we could say that it is also a network of financial institutions and financial instruments. Digital assets are distributed to investors via tokenizations instead of securitizations, crypto derivatives, and a crypto structured products that will likely develop in the near future. Here, there are new institutional investors. Stable coins replace money market funds, crypto hedge funds, and crypto lending platforms also contribute to spreading these financial instruments. The causes of its establishment are rather different, but there is a financial need consisting in the demand for faster and informal means of investment, favored by a slow regulatory response. And the competition here is towards traditional banks, asset managers, and service providers, such as prime brokers and custodians, as well as shadow banking. The innovation here is in the dual form of, the dual layer of financial engineering coupled with technological infrastructural innovation. Let's look at the problems generated by crypto shadow banking. Excessive leverage and opacity originate from short selling and margin trading, commonly known also in the traditional shadow banking, as well as new instruments such as perpetual swaps that allow for leverage up to 100 times. Crypto lending also is a reason for opacity because centralized platforms are inherently less transparent than decentralized ones. Liquidity risks in crypto shadow banking originate from the quality of tokenized assets, generally very illiquid, as well as the risk emerging from stablecoin reserves and the way they are invested in illiquid assets. We can observe a general lack of crypto assets rating, as well as a problem in the regulation of market infrastructures. If you think about crypto exchanges, you will realize how they are invading new businesses beyond the natural function of creating new markets. So we are observing, even in this context, the emergence of too big to fail entities that have a dominant position. What we can think about all these? Well, this is a very new context, but is posing, however, very old problems. And what regulators can do? Well, they should try to think about the existing tools in order to address in the best way all these problems and contribute to the establishment of a sustainable digital finance framework for the future. Thank you so much. I look forward to receiving your question via email or other channels.
Well, that was a really interesting presentation and one that is of relevance for many of us watching. And I'm delighted to transition into a conversation with relevance for almost all of us, which is with Brian Brooks, the acting the acting comptroller of the currency, who's really been at the forefront of a number of initiatives that have worked to reshape the conversation on cryptocurrency here in the United States, and with it, really conversations on banking and the business of banking. Brian, thanks so much for making it.
Chris, thanks for having me. It's a great to see you here, even with the screen in the middle of it.
Right. Thank you so much. I think we can just jump right into it and talk about some of your agency's work on crypto. I mean, you have been, I think busy is an understatement for really the work that you've been able to do in the last couple of months. And recently you issued a letter clarifying how banks can provide custody services for customers' crypto assets. And in that letter, you sort of clarify that where banks can hold reserves that back stablecoin held in sort of hosted wallets, there were certain kinds of standards that were announced. I mean, why were those moves necessary and what did they accomplish?
Well, so Chris, first of all, thanks for that question. And I'm really glad that you're spending some time on crypto here, because I think that the macro thesis of crypto and the future of crypto is probably not well enough understood or thought about enough by people who are in kind of mainstream finance. So I'm going to kind of come at it from that perspective. What we're trying to do with these letters is to solve the problem of banks over the last 4 or 5 years have basically treated crypto as though it was like a pawn shop or, some other kind of, a drug dispensary, some other kind of disfavored business that can't be touched. And the truth of the matter is that, like with any new financial asset, there are very, very strong positives. I'll talk about those in a second. There are also risks, and government has just not said enough about either the positives or the risks to create any kind of a safe framework in which banks felt comfortable operating. And so what we're trying to do is to, on the one hand, clearly articulate where we think the most important risks are. And, among others, we think those are in the world of money laundering and BSA compliance and terrorism financing. Those are real risks, hence the language about hosted wallets. But on the other hand, we also do see a future where decentralization is very likely an unstoppable force out there. Decentralized networks, by definition, are cheaper, faster, and more resilient than any kind of centralized structure. And now that the technology exists to make that possible, it seems not only good, but inevitable that those things will arise. So our point was, let's identify the risks. Let's also articulate that we believe there are strong use cases for these things, and banks should feel free to participate so long as they can adequately manage risk. Weirdly, no financial regulator has ever said that before. So you'd think this would be easier than it is, but that's where we are. And there's a lot more we need to say about this. There are certain kinds of tokens out there that present privacy and law enforcement issues. We should opine on what we think about those things. There are stablecoin projects, located abroad that may or may not present monetary policy challenges to central bankers. All of these things need some attention on our part, and our hope is to be able to go through those one at a time.
I know you well enough to know that you know you've got to have bigger ideas. I know that you have bigger ideas about crypto than you know the custody, you know, crypto custody and stablecoin deposits. And as I said, you know, this goes to questions not only about this particular product, but about banks and banking and the like. So from that standpoint, from that financial standpoint, you had sort of signaled what's the big picture in your mind for crypto's use case in terms of the federal banking system. Our earlier panels, some with our earlier panel coming from Asia, as well as with some conversations with central bankers in different parts of the world, we're trying to opine sort of what the use case would be, also in light of the values of the different countries that could be potentially issuing them. But when you think about a stable coin, you know, and crypto more generally, what kind of use cases do you see, and what are the next big steps for crypto in the federal banking system?
Yeah, well, so look, there are a number of different theses for different kinds of crypto projects. In the same way that, you know, I always point out the fact that I've got 5 or 6 different communication apps on my phone, right? And they do all convey information, but they're all different. I have, you know, I might have WhatsApp for a reason that's different from email. They're both places I can type information, but I use one sometimes for certain things and others sometimes for different things. So the way I think about it is at the most basic level, we have banks for the same reason that we have the post office. It's for a historically vestigial reason, okay? Once upon a time, in a pre-technology era, the only way to move money or information from point A to point B was to take all of the money or all of the information and aggregate it in one place, and then you could lend it out to some people and you could collect payments from other people all in that central hub. That's why, you know, if you think back to the medieval origin of banking, it was really to finance the great wars of Europe, where you might have a king of England trying to finance a war with the Duke of Padua or whatever, you know, and they didn't know each other, and the people who wanted to finance that didn't know each other, and you needed some central trusted ledger keeper. That was necessary at a time when we didn't have technology, but now we have technology, which may mean that we don't necessarily need either the service of a central ledger keeper or the aggregation of all the money in one place to be borrowed and lent, because the technology makes it immediately possible for you and me to transact directly, even if we don't know each other. We used to need banks for that, but now we have technology for that. And so at the most basic level, that's what's going on. When you talk about stable coins versus when you talk about Bitcoin versus when you talk about privacy tokens, you know, these are all doing different things, much like the communications apps on our phone. So if you ask me what's the thesis for Bitcoin, the thesis for Bitcoin is one day it's possible that America and Europe and other places will adopt monetary policies that look like Venezuela's monetary policy, and government-issued currency will no longer have value because it will be debased, right? As Brad said on your previous conversation, you know, at some point there will be real inflation in the system. So that's the thesis of Bitcoin. It's not supposed to do anything other than be rationed. That's its core value. Stablecoins are kind of different. The idea of stablecoins are, hey, we could take something that has a knowable value. You know, we could either back it based on an algorithmic activity, or we could back it based on dollars in the bank. But we could take this thing that we know has value and we could internetify it, right? We could make it so that it's programmable and instantaneous and doesn't rely on the internal workings of a bank to transact. So it's like we know people want this because they already sign up for Zelle and Venmo. But the problem is Zelle and Venmo aren't interoperable with each other. They're closed loop kinds of systems. Stablecoins are all about the concept of the internet, fully interoperable. You don't have to be on Zelle to receive a Venmo payment, right? Here, I can transact with anybody who's connected to the internet, and that's a good thing for stablecoins. And then ultimately, really, Chris, I think the real use case of crypto is in a world of increasing integration and increasing globalization. It really makes no sense to think that anyone across borders who wants to transact with each other has to pay a foreign exchange fee to change yen into dollars, let's just say, and then also to pay a money transmitter for the act of hitting the send button and sending that money across a proprietary platform. Imagine if there was a single token that was recognized on both sides of that divide. And when you received it, you could cash it out into your local currency. And when I received it, I could cash it out into my local currency without the need to change it, right? Those kinds of things occupies so many trillions of dollars of friction in the system that it's, when people say there's no killer app to crypto, I sort of think, no. The killer app of crypto is the simplest application, which is avoiding frictions. That's what it's all about, much as the internet did for sending information.
You know, you talked about sort of, or you conceive and think about the use case for crypto really from the standpoint of decentralization combined with, I guess, a kind of interoperability, especially in the case of stablecoins. But writ large, I guess crypto then is obviously one of those tools fueling the decentralization of finance or DeFi. And you've observed on many occasions that the other sort of force reshaping banking is something that you describe as unbundling, right? And that really goes to what you were just mentioned in terms of the historical sort of evolution of the origins of banking, and now you're trying to sort of identify or think through what banking looks like now. But I think let's try to go that direction a little bit more explicitly. What does banking look like for you after unbundling? You know, sort of post DeFi. You know, what do you see from an operational standpoint in terms of the place of banks, right, in the banking system, and literally what it means to be a bank, and then what do you think consumers will then be able to look forward to, and the challenges that arise?
Yeah. So Chris, here's how I think about it. And I think you're exactly right when you say, what does it mean to be a bank? Because I think the nomenclature sometimes gets in the way of having this conversation. So let's start with first principles here. Human beings need financial services. They don't need banks. Banks are entities that exist among other entities to provide financial services to people. So when I say that, what do I mean people need financial services? Well, it's like most of us could not afford to buy a house if we had to pay cash for it. You have to be super rich to be able to just write a check for your house. And so we need someone else to float us that money for a period of time, and we're willing to pay them a rate of interest on it. So we need lending like that. Businesses sometimes need leverage in order to achieve target rates of return. So again, they need to borrow money from someplace in order to do that. People need to go to college. That costs money. Many of us take out student loans to go to college. Or, you know, we need to pay the babysitter and we want to write her a check or send her money from an account. So we need some place to process that payment, but we also need some place to hold our money in some safe way, which we call deposits typically. Those are things we need to live our lives. The companies that have historically served those needs are called banks. But the reason that those were the kinds of companies who served those needs was because, again, in a pre-technology era, we needed one place to hold all of the money in order for it to be efficient to provide all of those other services. And so banks could gather deposits on a low-cost basis and then use that giant amount of money to make loans and do all kinds of other things. In steps technology. Suddenly, Chris, it is possible for you to just go online and say, hey, listen, I've got $10,000 here, and I'd like it to earn 5%. Does anybody want to take my $10,000 and pay me 5%? And the algorithm will find someone who does. And all of a sudden, there's no longer a value in the bank aggregating all of that money together because the technology is substituting for the aggregation function of banks. Whoa, right? And if that sounds complicated, just come back to the post office analogy that I usually use. Back in the day before there was email, the only efficient way for me to send information to Chris across the country was I would take a letter and I'd go take it to the mailbox, and the mail collector would come and put it in one giant repository of all of the thousands of letters everywhere in the United States. And then they would say, okay, all letters going to New York, get on this Pony Express. All letters going to Los Angeles, get on that Pony Express. And they do that like once a day. That made sense before we had technology. But with email, we don't need the aggregation anymore. We don't. We can do it directly with each other and forget the aggregation. That's what it's ultimately all about. So the question, what are banks going to be good for in this era, is a really interesting one. I think the truth is they're going to be good for a lot, just not the aggregation of money necessarily, right? So what I think banks are great for is they're great for value add services. They're great for advice, for fiduciary stuff, for custody of physical assets. And eventually I expect that banks, much as the banks are all connected to the Fed payment system, they're all connected to the automated clearinghouse system and the SWIFT network, I expect that there is a future where banks will be directly connected to blockchains where, they will see that as a payment network and they will become nodes on that network, along with all kinds of other companies that are also nodes on that network. If that happens, banks may be able to mint their own stable coins, in a way that would allow them to very readily design value-add money transmission instruments, much as, American Express innovated the world of traveler's checks 2 generations ago. So I think there's a huge role for banks, but it's a transformational role because the legacy role of being an aggregator of dollars may be completely disintermediated, which will then allow them to focus on the higher value-add, higher profit services that they are best at anyway.
Do you have a sense, you have an insider's view on so many things that are happening both in the banking space and in the blockchain space? I mean, do you have a sense as to, or do you anticipate that transformation being faster, slower? Certainly it would depend on a number of factors. What do you perceive as the major factors driving that transformational change and the degree to which the federal regulators are going to have to sort of grapple with it? What are you seeing in your brief but very active time over at the OCC?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, Chris, on the brief but active thing, I am a big believer in the idea that it's not about the age, it's the mileage. So we got a lot of mileage on it. But look, the mistake I think that regulators often make is the belief that if something new enters the system, the new thing is risky relative to the old thing, which because it's old is somehow seen as not risky. We need to recognize that the status quo is risky in all kinds of ways. There's a lot of money laundering that goes on in the status quo banking system. There's also a lot of interest rate friction, a lot of chargeback risk, and all kinds of other things. So the first thing we need to get comfortable with is the idea that the status quo is not the risk-free environment. It has a set of risks and benefits, and change has a set of risks and benefits. So we should always be doing a net risk calculation, not like a sort of a standalone risk calculation, is the first thing I would say. And then, where I sort of go is the notion that in the future, for banks to perform the services that people need, they're going to have to sort of compete with other alternatives. That's as true for regulators as it is for innovators. So if you look at the US relative to other countries right now, the EU has published a draft stablecoin framework. We haven't. We've made a lot of law enforcement statements about how we expect BSA and other things to be complied with, but we've said nothing about how, these are the conditions under which we think a stablecoin would be a good thing for the country. Instead, we're still talking about a government-built token system that might come online in 4 years. So we're years behind places like Europe in terms of articulating what we think could be a framework to let these things grow. In the meantime, corporate America is not waiting for that. So we've all read a lot about Facebook's Libra project with its various ups and downs. We've read less about other stablecoin projects like the Circle partnership for USDC or the Gemini coin or the Paxos coin. But if you look, Chris, over the last month or two, and you just look at the growth trajectory of these stablecoin projects, these have been doubling in market capitalization roughly every 60 days for the last 6 months. That's an incredible hockey stick asymptotic rate of growth, which tells us the market wants these things and the market will have these things. So we can try to push back as long as we can, kind of like the taxi cab commissions did with Uber, and we saw how that ended. Or we can embrace it and say, look, the good parts of this are very, very good. And we need to come out now and get in front of it by saying, we're okay with these projects as long as they meet these parameters, and only outside the parameters are we going to have problems. We need to be clearer about that if we want to be competitive as a country and if we want to avoid bad outcomes as markets move in the direction they're going to choose.
So let's, we don't have too much more time, so I want to just switch gears to a couple of things that I know people here in Washington, D.C. are thinking about. Many of the objectives of the work over the OCC has to do with increasing financial inclusion. And, when we chatted just last time, I think in June, we had discussed the Community Reinvestment Act. And since then, the Fed has issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, sort of starting or kickstarting its own formal rulemaking. And there's some overlap between what the Fed is thinking about doing and obviously what you've proposed, but there are also some important differences. I mean, what would you highlight about the OCC's rule when people are trying to compare the two rules? And what do you see as the primary points of collaboration or overlap, and then where do you see the two approaches diverging the most?
Well, look, Chris, first of all, I appreciate you asking the question. I think the Senate is going to be voting on the Community Reinvestment Act rule today, actually. So it's a really good day to have this conversation. First of all, I'm a big believer in Ronald Reagan's dictum that it's amazing what you can get done if you don't care who gets the credit. So credit where credit's due. I think there's a lot of good stuff in the Fed's rule, and it is very possible that their ANPR will result in new ideas and intelligence that we have not considered that we could look at, next year to make our rule even better. So I think that's terrific, and I welcome what they're doing. At the same time, I'm also a big believer in not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I think everybody gets, and I think the Fed's release shows that they agree, that the status quo is untenable. It's just untenable. And it's untenable because it ignores the fact that banks mostly do not provide their services through branches at the level that they used to 25 years ago when the CRA was last revised. And so we need to get away from branches as the touchstone of geographic assessment areas, and the Fed's rule does that. I think there's also a recognition in the Fed's rule, as in the OCC's rule, that there are groups that were excluded from CRA benefits generally that shouldn't be. For example, Indian country or farming communities, which really were never captured in the original concept of the CRA in 1977, when it was really focused on urban blight and redlining in big cities. So they do all of those things. I would tell you the main area of difference, there's a few others, but the main area of difference between our rule and the Fed's rule seems to be in the nature of discretion and how much subjectivity should there be in rating how banks perform. That's an issue where I'm happy to sort of put it out there for kind of a general plebiscite. Who thinks it's better for bank examiners to subjectively decide whether a bank has done enough versus telling banks clearly what the rules are and what expectations we think they should meet? It would be sort of like, who wants an objective speed limit on the freeway where you're not speeding if you're not driving 75 versus a subjective rule where you can be pulled over anytime a policeman thinks you're driving maybe a little faster than he'd like? I think that question answers itself. But other than the discretion and the subjectivity, the rules are largely similar, which I think is great. And again, if we learn things from their ANPR, we're happy to make it better. We're not here for the credit, right? We're here to make credit and investment more available to the people who need it most.
Right. Well, we only have a minute, but I did want to speak as well to a question that many people are asking, particularly as the economy is sort of decelerating a bit. Not just the United States, but the world is still struggling to manage COVID-19. What's your sense as to how the banking system is holding up? How well are policymakers doing in balancing different kinds of risk and reward trade-offs? And then secondly, when you look at the health of the banking system, how does that impact your decision-making when it comes to these new financial products and the evolution in banking with obviously the rise of stablecoins and other kinds of digital assets?
Yeah, well, that's a lot. So I'm just going to tick off a few things because I know we've only got 60 seconds left. So first of all, I'm going to say the economy is not decelerating. The rate of acceleration is slowing, but we are still expanding. So let's be super clear. There's no deceleration out there. Second, in terms of the system seems to still be okay. We're coming to the end of the additional runway provided by PPP and other programs. But on the other hand, unemployment continues to fall and consumer spending, retail spending, and other things continue to rise. So I would say that we may thread the needle on this one. I certainly hope that we thread the needle, but that does depend on the economy reopening as fast as the PPP proceeds and other things are running off. Those lines need to intersect at the right moment for us to be okay. Banks are well provisioned, obviously, all of that stuff is good. Then you get to the question on, are we balancing costs and benefits right? Listen, does anybody think we're balancing costs and benefits? Does anybody think that there is any factor driving decision-making in this country right now other than COVID? I think not. And I think as a society, we do need to start having the conversation of, if somebody told us that our mortality risk in the society went from 0.0001% to 0.002%, which would be a doubling, but from one small number to another small number, and the cost of that, of shutting down in order to avoid that other small number, is mass dislocation and suicides and depressions and divorces and everything else, I think you would say we're only focused on one objective right now. And we're a big enough country and a good enough country. We can talk and chew gum at the same time. We can balance risks and benefits. We can understand this virus isn't going to go away if we lock down. That's not what viruses do. So what we need to start doing is understanding how does an economy live with this thing and thrive and grow. Other countries are doing that. You know, the news this morning is that China's productivity post-coronavirus is almost where it was pre-coronavirus, and that's in less than a year. Ours is nowhere close to that, although the trend lines are good, and it's nowhere close because we refuse to that there are other values in society in addition to coronavirus avoidance. So I think we need to balance risks and benefits of all of these things to come up with the right place. I think the trend lines are positive, but I would not say we're out of the woods yet.
Thank you so much, Ryan. As always, the OCC has been with DC FinTech Week from the very, very start years ago. And as always, we're really appreciative of the OCC and you and your support. We're going to be following this discussion and moving forward with a conversation on just how stable are stablecoins. And it'll be coming up right next. Well, I'm really looking forward to this panel, and I would like to welcome Aaron Stanley of Coindesk. And big thanks to Coindesk and the Coindesk team for being one of our knowledge partners today. And Sanaya, thank you very much as well to Teja from TD Ameritrade, who was back from earlier today and on our panel on what's happening in crypto in Asia. And they will be here to moderate today's stablecoins panel. So please take it away.
Aaron, your camera is muted.
Great, thanks, Chris. And welcome everybody to our panel on stablecoins. My name is Aaron Stanley, and I'm Managing Director here for events content at Coindesk, which is the largest blockchain digital currency focused media and events company out there. I'm joined by Sunaina Tuteja, Head of Digital Assets at TD Ameritrade. And for the next 45 minutes, we'll be digging into the topic of stablecoins. As Brian Brooks was just mentioning in the previous session, the third quarter was probably the biggest ever for stablecoins, not only in terms of market cap, but also in terms of adoption and the regulatory roadmap. So we're going to be diving in and breaking that all down for you. Sunaina, do you want to introduce yourself quick and then introduce our panel for today?
Absolutely. Thank you, Aaron. And thank you, Chris and team, for always finding the art of the possible and bringing us all together. Even though we can't all be in our favorite city of DC, it's great to be connected to amazing panelists offering amazing perspectives from around the world. And for me personally, it's a nice pivot from all the binge watching I've been doing to a week of binge learning. So thank you. As Aaron mentioned, I'm the Head of Digital Assets at TD Ameritrade. Clearly stable coins are top of mind, as you even heard, Brian in his conversation with Chris just now. And, I know every moderator is going to say this, but Aaron and I frankly believe that we have an all-star panel assembled here who represent operators, investors, regulators, and will really offer us a diverse slate of perspectives on this topic of stablecoins. And one of the cool things I also like about this panel is they come at it in a very balanced view. And what I mean by that is often things in crypto are nicely packaged with a healthy dose of hype and hyperbole, and stable coins are no exception. And, they're often presented as a panacea. And what's great about this panelist is they have a deep reservoir of expertise in this area, but they present to us not just what the opportunities are, but also what are the challenges and how we ought to pursue this exciting area of crypto with eyes wide open. And with that, I actually want to welcome our panelists and give them an opportunity to briefly introduce themselves. And I'll start with our friend Nick Carter, sporting his fancy Bitcoin pin there. So Nick, passing the baton to you.
Thank you, Sunaina. Thanks for having me. Chris, thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Third year in a row. It's my favorite conference. I'm Nick Carter. I'm a general partner at Castle Island Ventures, which is a early stage blockchain focused venture fund based here in Boston. So we invest in financial infrastructure, startups building on top of public blockchains. And obviously stablecoins are a key linchpin of that. They're kind of a core shared permissionless infrastructure that a huge number of startups are building on these days. And so that's why we're so focused on the opportunity. I'm also the founder of Coinmetrics, which is a blockchain analytics startup, and we cover a huge amount of data pertaining to stablecoins. One of the amazing things about them is that you can directly see in real time the usage traits and the free float and the growth in market capitalization, which has been pretty astonishing this year.
Thank you. Fanny, over to you.
Hi, I'm Fanny Wang. I'm a lawyer turned entrepreneur in the blockchain space. I've worked in a variety of different projects since 2016. Most recently, I was Associate General Counsel at MakerDAO, which is a decentralized stablecoin platform. And I'm currently working on a few of my own projects and also working with the Red Cross on their own community currency program, which is a kind of stablecoin that is designed for economic activity for people who are living on $2 a day to actually generate more real production in the flow of goods and services amongst these communities. So happy to also talk more about that.
Looking forward to it. Always inspiring. Nigel, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Sunaina. Thank you very much to you and Aaron and to Chris for the invitation. I'm Nigel Jenkinson. I'm the Division Chief of Financial Regulation Supervision at the IMF. And you know, the role of the team that I work with is to provide advice and support on anything in the area of financial regulation supervision. Clearly, fintech is hugely important these days, and stable coins are one important aspect of that. And recently, I'm a member of the FSB working group on regulatory issues of stable coins, which issued its report last week. So great to join the panel today. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll definitely be digging into the regulatory aspect quite a bit, so appreciate it. And last but not the least, our friend Alexander.
Well, everybody, Chris, thank you very much for the invitation. Sunana, Aaron, thank you for agreeing to, to run this panel. My name is Alex Lipton. For a little while, I was a professor of mathematics, and then for about 20 years, I was in investment banking, including the position of the global head of quants for Bank of America worldwide, and also quantitative solution executive for the holding group Bank of America. And then in 2016, I decided to go a little bit back to my academic roots, as well as to start an entrepreneurial enterprise. And so I became a fellow at MIT, a professor and dean's fellow at the Hebrew University, and the co-founder and chief information officer of SILA, which is an innovative programmable money provider based in Seattle, Portland. Portland, Oregon. Portland, Oregon.
Awesome. Never a dull moment in Alex's world. Okay. So, as you've been hearing today, a lot of talk about stable coins, and we certainly see a massive adoption and also proliferation of stable coins. But, an outcome of that has also become where stable coins have kind of become a catch-all for a lot of things that might or might not be a stable coin. And within the stable coin ecosystem, there's also, a multitude of use cases. So maybe let's start with some fundamental taxonomy. And for that, I would love to have Nick and Nigel weigh in, and maybe Nick, starting with you, looking at it from the perspective of the crypto world. How would you define stable coins, or as you coined the term, crypto dollars? And then Nigel would love to have your perspective from an IMF standpoint, how you define a stable coin and the difference between, a quote unquote stable coin and so-called global stable coin. So I think different perspectives, but important for us to hear it out. And Nick, I'll pass you the baton first.
Sure, thank you. And I definitely didn't coin crypto dollar. I'm just an enthusiast of the term and a supporter of the term. I think it's not set in stone, the fact that stablecoin will be the dominant term that's used here. I know whenever I see things from regulators or like the FATF, they don't really like the term very much. They claim that it's promotional, and so they call them so-called stable coins. So maybe a new term will emerge over time. It's not clear. The way I would define it would be a token circulating on a public blockchain, which is designed to track the return of a sovereign currency effectively. And there's a number of ways that this is attempted. One way is to have convertibility for dollars held in a, effectively commercial bank liabilities for deposits held in a bank. And then the other way, which is also pretty common in the crypto industry, is to create a reserve of risky collateral, which is kind of managed. And so that's not a convertible approach. So those are kind of the two main. So you have kind of the synthetic stable coins and the convertible stable coins. There's also algorithmic ones out there, which are sort of more exotic. Now, again, I think crypto dollar is more suited to describe the phenomenon, because we're talking about, for the most part, they're dollars. If you look at them, about 97% of all of the sort of circulating stable coins try and track the return of the dollar. And then crypto, to me, connotes the fact that they circulate on these open networks, which seems really important to me, because that's kind of the core value proposition. If you ask people to use stable coins, why they use them, it's because of this lack of encumbrance. So I would question if it would still be, a true crypto dollar if it was circulating on a private blockchain, for instance.
Thank you. Well articulated always. Nigel, I'd love to hear the perspective from an IMF vantage point.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Sunaina. And just following up from Chris, I think, the word stable coin is one that is, bandied about a lot. And indeed, the report that I was, a member of the group on, used the term so-called stable coins, because I think, there is unease about the term as Nick described. But my definition would be, or categorization would be, it's a specific category of crypto assets, which aims to maintain value against a particular currency or currencies, or potentially something else, such as a commodity or basket of commodities. That would be how I would term stable coin, but I think, as Nick described, there's many different types and varieties of this. So I think there is a question about the term. On your point about global stable coins, I think a global stable coin is one which essentially is viewed as having extensive reach, within and across borders. So it's one that has a potential global and significant cross-border reach. But that would be how I would define it, Sunaina. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks both for that. Now that we're all on the same page, more or less, as far as how we're defining these instruments, we're going to dive a bit into how they're being used and the volume at which they're being used. And I think the third quarter of 2020, as we mentioned earlier, is really a seminal period of time for stablecoins. In just 3 months, the total market cap of these instruments nearly doubled from 12 billion to 20 billion. And that $20 billion figure marks like a more than 1,000% year-over-year increase. So it's definitely the hockey stick growth, as acting Comptroller Brooks was alluding to on the previous panel. And we've been seeing stable coins being issued across a broader array of different blockchains as well. So there's stable coins beyond like Tether, which is kind of the the largest by market cap. But there's multiple other stable coins that are being issued across different blockchains, and there's really being just a massive amount of uptake here. So there's a lot of factors that are driving this. So I think we'll turn to Nick initially, because that data I was just stating was from Coinmetrics, your company. So maybe let's get some color from you on just the uptick in adoption here, and then so who's issuing these? Like, what are people using them for? And then I'd like to turn over to Fenny as well to talk a bit about what you've seen in the maker ecosystem with DAI. So Nick, go ahead.
Sure, yeah. So the biggest stable coin, again, people might question whether it would be considered stable or not, is Tether at about $16 billion of market capitalization, which is much larger than the second largest one, USDC. And one of the interesting features of the system is that the entities that use these stablecoins don't necessarily want third parties to know what they're doing with them. So it's always a challenge to get reliable data on what the usage modes are. They follow kind of a semi-private, not fully private, but sort of semi-private model where you don't necessarily need to, share KYC data with the blockchain to make a transaction. All you need is a wallet effectively. But there are kind of a few key catalysts which I think can help explain the growth of stablecoins. One is more crypto companies denominating their balance sheet, transforming their working capital into stablecoins to have liquidity, which is present on crypto rails, which means they can kind of access opportunities much more quickly as opposed to having fiat currency in banks on their balance sheet. Another one would just be the rise of commerce denominated in stablecoins. There's plenty of venture funds out there that are settling deals in USDC terms instead of sending bank wires, because these are 24/7 networks. You can settle and close a deal on a weekend. And then one interesting feature of the last few months is the rise of, this is a very idiosyncratic crypto concept, but the rise of kind of yield farming, it's called, which is effectively a new way of issuing pseudo equity tokens on public blockchains. And the way that people would get exposure to that would be by effectively locking up some collateral in a smart contract. And the preferred means of doing that was with stable coins. And so that basically created, structurally high interest rates in the crypto industry on public blockchains. And that sort of sucked in a lot of collateral from the regular banking system into the crypto system. So that probably explains a lot of the growth in the last year. But as I said, some of it is also mystery because stablecoin users aren't necessarily that forthcoming with their intentions.
Great, thanks for that. Fenny, what have you seen in the Maker ecosystem with DAI?
Yeah, so I'll explain a little bit for those who aren't familiar about Maker and how DAI works. So DAI is a little bit different than a stablecoin such as USDC. So going back to perhaps the taxonomy question, you have certain types of stable coins that are one-to-one backed by fiat in some bank account. There's an issuer that's regulated in some form. So we're seeing new regulation trying to clarify that. But in those cases of USDC, there is a dollar somewhere, and against that, you can issue this ERC token representing a claim on that dollar in a bank account somewhere against the issuer. But what's different about DAI stablecoin is that it is possible for someone to generate or issue DAI themselves against their crypto assets. So what's different here is you are putting up your crypto assets, say Ether, as collateral against which you can issue DAI. So you get the benefit of having a stablecoin like DAI, which you can use in various applications as a form of crypto payment or for the yield farming phenomenon that Nick described. But you get to also keep your underlying collateral. So if I wanted to get USDC, I would have to sell, say, ETH or some other, or use cash to get the USDC and do something with it. But with DAI, I could generate it by putting up my crypto assets as collateral. Now, of course, there is a collateralization ratio, so I have to over-collateralize against the amount of DAI that I'm generating. So if the prices of the underlying collateral decline, then there's a risk of getting liquidated. So that's how the overall MakerDAO system works as a general concept. There's been exponential growth in the supply of DAI the last couple of months because of what's been happening in the decentralized finance markets with the advent of yield farming, as Nick described. So I think I'm looking actually at the block Explorer right now. So this is all up-to-date information. There's close to $1 billion or $1 billion actually worth of DAI outstanding in circulation. So it's quite a phenomenal level of growth. And there's questions as to how these different types of stable coins will be used and compete as the market matures, which I think is quite exciting.
Great. So since we're kind of on the topic of decentralized finance right now, and been talking about yield farming and some of these other applications. Maybe it'd be a good time to dive into that a little bit more, just briefly. One of the big sort of developments of the last few months has been the emergence of these new exchanges that are essentially automated market makers, and a lot of stablecoin volume has been locked up on these exchanges, or have been provided as liquidity on these exchanges. Alex, can you explain to us just what exactly like an automated market maker is, and why people are putting their stable coins in these protocols?
Yeah, with pleasure, Aaron, with pleasure. So, you know, automated market maker is actually an idea which is very pertinent to the framework of Ethereum and other blockchains, which you know, provide consensus as a service, if you wish. That's what Ethereum really does. And then you can run all kind of tokens on Ethereum itself without bothering to you know, make sure that they are internally consistent, because that would be done for you by the Ethereum protocol, right? Of course, make no mistake, Ethereum protocol is not nearly as powerful as people think it is, and it's extremely expensive. So basically, it all comes with a price tag attached, and clearly, you know, some other consensus mechanisms are needed in order to make this whole idea practical. But however it might be, given that in the real economy, interest rates are de minimis, people are looking for something else to do. And so one possibility is to become a market maker, right? Right now in the real economy, you know, only huge efforts, really huge efforts need to be exerted to become a market maker. So the Citadels of the world, one of my places where I used to work and so on and so forth, are very, very big, but they spend billions and billions to build the infrastructure and so on and so forth, whilst smart contracts offer a very cheap alternative. You put in a pool of liquidity on both sides of a market-making effort. So for example, between two stable coins, or between Ethereum and say USDC, something like that. And then you actually follow a very simple rule. So for example, one of the popular rules is that the product of the number of tokens on one hand and the other hand is constant, as simple as that. And indeed, if you think about it, this rule will never exhaust the pool. It will adjust to the outside evolution of the price, et cetera, et cetera. And then what is bad?
So what's my motivation for, like, what would be my motivation to put my DAI into
well, I will come to that, because by doing this, right, by doing this, you become a market maker. So being a market maker is simultaneously an obligation and a privilege. On the privilege side is that you will be collecting the bid-ask spread. Essentially, when I try to take, for example, one token in exchange for the other, I actually need to put a little more of the token which I need to put in, and that is kind of bid-ask spread. Essentially, think about it that on top of the equilibrium price, you will be kind of collecting 1% bid-ask spread, which is a perfectly legitimate way to do this, and that's how it is done in real world as well. Maybe not 1% smaller than that, but still, right? And then, you know, if the price of these two tokens oscillates around the equilibrium, then you will be chocolate, because you will be collecting this premium, and it will be a machine for producing essentially yield, right? So you put in two pools of collateral, and you now get a constant reward, right, in the form of dividends or interest. You can think about it as, you know, as a bond of some sort. However, you know, as everything else, you know, the hype goes ahead of common sense. So essentially, the product itself has, in the parlance of conventional mathematical finance, has negative convexity. It means that deviation from the equilibrium in both down and up will always result in the owner of the pool actually losing money. This is kind of the way it is done. As I said, if people don't like the word stable coin, they should probably like even less the concept of impermanent loss. So impermanent loss is perceived that when you deviate from the equilibrium, you lose money, but then you will come back to the equilibrium. So if it does come back to the equilibrium, you receive your returns in the form of market making fees. However, if it deviates away from it, you will lose money, and arguably more than you put in. So that's in essence how the whole thing works. To make a long story short, the smart contracts allows you to compete in a very naive way, but still to compete with big boys and girls who are doing market making for a living. And if everything goes well, you will be receiving a stream of dividend for your effort. Yeah, that's
sure. So it's essentially the democratization of market making.
Precisely. You can think about it like
any average Joe can pool his. Like I for instance have some guy pooled in a Uniswap liquidity pool right now, and I'm earning a steady flow of the trading fees that come across that. And I guess I probably am a little bit naive about it, as you mentioned, but I'm one of those naive people. But
well,
but I'm learning.
You know, markets.
That's the fun thing is that we're learning. Like we can actually experiment with these things and learn on our own.
Exactly.
It's not just for the Wall Street elite, you know.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So Sunaina, since we're kind of talking about use cases here, did you want to tee up kind of next round about just where else these coins are being used, aside from automated market making?
Yeah, and you made a good point there that these things are supposedly built for people not just on Wall Street, and maybe I would kind of offer the contrarian view that while the ethos of financial inclusion and leveling the playing field for the masses is a stated goal of many crypto projects, especially in stablecoin, we still have a pretty wide delta between that rhetoric and what we're seeing in terms of actionable use cases. So maybe Fenny, you can convince me otherwise, because in your opening you did talk a little bit about the merit of using stablecoin for community initiatives and how it can help local economies. And really kind of, bearing the fruit of financial inclusion. So would love to hear more about that.
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you for that. So my first observation, having been in the DeFi space, is that all of these stable coins today, they're really primarily used crypto natives for crypto trading, speculative activities around whether it's DAI or USDC, and actually even with the one-to-one backed stable coins like USDC or Gemini Dollar or Paxos, I mean, in theory, there shouldn't be any fluctuation in the price of those stable coins because the issuers are regulated, and so you're supposed to be guaranteed this redemption at par. Actually, that's what the regulation in Europe around stable coins is clarifying, is this guarantee around redemptions and what those rights look like. So then I thought to myself, well, why is it that these stable coins all fluctuate in price? And it's because of the activity profile of who's actually using it. And where I get concerned is that if you have your predominant users of these stable coins are using it in these high volatility contexts for speculative purposes, is it wise to have ordinary consumers use the same asset? Because what you're effectively doing there is have the ordinary businesses and ordinary consumers who just want to use it for payment purposes, in effect subsidizing the stability or volatility of the activities of all the speculative trading using that stable coin. So that's one thing I don't think, it's a very subtle point that I don't think is appreciated yet. So that gets me the point of, well, how do we think about using these stablecoin mechanisms in a way that is directly designed for stimulating actual economic productive activity? So this is where I get to the phenomenon of local currencies or complementary currencies. The idea around a community currency predates stablecoins way back. And Nick probably knows this history better than I do around free banking. So when banks were plentiful, they would issue their own sort of note. And then communities would also issue amongst themselves their own form of local currency, or basically like a voucher, where they said, well, we don't have money, we don't have federal dollars, but we've got goods and services, we've got economic potential here. So instead of trying to barter, why don't we create this voucher that we will accept as if it were currency amongst each other, so that we can stimulate economic activity. And as these projects kind of moved on, what they've discovered is that these local currencies are a great way to ensure that that capital and funding stays within a local economy. So the velocity of money is actually much higher for local currencies than the national currency, because you're forced to spend it within that locality. And what's very interesting is taking this concept and turning them into cryptocurrencies for efficiency and greater data visibility. So a project that I'm working with the Red Cross in Kenya, they've been doing local currency programs predating crypto since 2010. And then starting in 2018, they turned that into a cryptocurrency that is being used by over 40,000 people now in predominantly rural parts of Kenya. And the phenomenon is getting to see this data from the blockchain, and you can calculate the velocity of the multiplier effect, right? How fast the money recirculates. So with an airdrop of say, 1.5 million USD worth of this local currency, you can see that it's been retransacted up to 11 times just within the last 9 months. So this is an incredible amount of economic activity that is being activated by having this cryptocurrency in the system. And so the idea here is, what if we could create so something like a USDC, but it would be within a jurisdiction. So in the US, we actually have a local currency program that's been in circulation since 2006 up in the Berkshires region. So Nick, I suggest you should go there and visit. It's in your woods. And they've created this currency called Berkshires that is used amongst all these local small businesses. And they estimate there's a 4 times circulation of that money, which is much higher than the US dollar, which only has about a 1x circuit. So basically there's no multiplier effects. So if we can get banks to issue these community currencies for their local economy, you get actually 2 multiplier effects. So I think Brian Brooks in the previous session talked about the Community Reinvestment Act. So this is my pitch to Brian. If you can get community development financial institutions, which are banks, some of them are banks, to be the issuer of community currencies, the reserves, the fiat reserves would go into these banks as deposits, and they can then lend out 90% of that into the community. And being community development banks, they're required to relend into these underserved communities. So you're getting a multiplier effect there from the reserves based on fractional reserve banking. And then you're getting this additional multiplier effect with the stablecoin itself, the community currency itself, recirculating at a higher rate within this network of local small businesses. So I think I think this is sort of the next phenomenon that I get really excited about, that here's a possibility of what this technology can do outside of just crypto trading.
Yeah, it's a really interesting use case. I think, just this idea of using it almost as like a local voucher program, or I'm even thinking of, when I buy like a coupon book to support the local football team or something, and I can redeem those coupons at different local stores and things of that nature. But I can't do anything with it outside of my community, but I can use it within the local area. So there's another interesting kind of commerce-based use case that I wanted to throw out there and see if folks had thoughts on this. But So Coindesk reported last year that like local Chinese importers in Russia were actually using Tether, the largest stablecoin, as a remittance service to send like something like $30 million a day back to China. So these Chinese importers in Moscow, they would drop off bags of cash of Russian rubles at OTC desks in Moscow. They exchange rubles for Tether, send that Tether back to China, and then they would, exit into one and be a local market maker. And this was something like $30 million a day that we reported this was happening. And it kind of highlights this idea of like censorship resistance as a use case here. And Nick, I know you mentioned earlier that like a lot of the people that are using these coins are, they don't necessarily want other people to know what they're doing or who they are. And without, making any judgments about what these people's intentions are, I mean, it could be perfectly fine. But like, what's your overall thinking around this idea of like censorship resistance as a use case? I mean, is this like a net positive, or is this something that people should be concerned about?
I mean, honestly, that's largely the purpose of crypto financial infrastructure, is to make financial decisions that some powerful third party doesn't want you to make. If you look at Tether, you look at when the transactions occur, most of them are happening on Asian trading hours. So it's not necessarily a Western phenomenon. And what's the reason for that? Well, China has capital controls, and a lot of people have an interest in evading those capital controls. That's kind of a plain fact, and not saying it with any aspersions, but fundamentally, crypto, public blockchains, the entire premise is giving people more discretion over their wealth. And now stablecoins complicate that slightly, because you have a lot of them have these centralized issuers that can freeze accounts, freeze balances at their sole discretion. In fact, Tether has frozen, I believe, 100 accounts, and USDC has started to freeze accounts. They have different standards for what's worthy of freezing. Tether actually has more of a hair trigger finger in terms of what's worthy of freezing, whereas USDC has said they'll only freeze balances with a really concrete request from law enforcement. So there's kind of distinctions there, but fundamentally, one of the key premises of stablecoins is flattening out the kind of global financial infrastructure and routing around the kind of established correspondent banking system and creating a new alternative. And that's what we see them being used for.
All right, well, I guess that's a nice segue into our regulation topic here, right? So Nigel, tell us a bit about, I mean, the third quarter, we saw a whole sort of groundswell of activity on the regulation, stablecoin regulation front in the US, EU, other jurisdictions, multilateral bodies. Maybe give us kind of an overview of what some of the key developments were over the last couple months from your vantage point.
Okay, thanks very much, Aaron. Yeah, I mean, a lot has sort of happened over the last few months. I mean, I think the real catalyst for this was the G20 at the global level was the G20 summit or the G20 meeting held last week, where the FSB produced a report on the regulatory issues on so-called global stable coins, and that sets out really 10 high-level recommendations for the regulatory community on how to approach the regulation of global stable coins. Those principles are necessarily at a relatively high level because of some of the issues that have already been discussed and challenged. There are many different types of stable coins. So actually, the regulatory issues are rather different and depend very much on the particular case. But the high-level principles and recommendations are designed to frame the overall approach by regulators. And what we're now seeing in some national jurisdictions, you mentioned the US and EU, is we're now beginning to see national frameworks adapting or issuing their own sort of regulatory rules on guidelines on different aspects of stable coins. But as well as the work by the regulatory group, we also have seen reports coming out by the Financial Action Task Force, and also the IMF itself has done some work, and indeed is published today, basically the kind of cross-border payments and digitalization, which includes stable coins, but a lot of it is about cross-border digital use of digital currencies. And we've also seen agreements at the G20 level on a roadmap for improving cross-border payments. So I think all these things are kind of coming together in a sense of tackling some of the issues in respect of can we improve the payment infrastructure, particularly the cross-border payment infrastructure. And the regulatory group on stablecoins is really setting out a frame and set of parameters to try and ensure that one can maintain financial stability, that one can maintain trust and confidence, that one can address financial integrity, and that one can meet money laundering kind of rules and regulations. And some of those, of course, are quite challenging, given the comments that that Nick just mentioned. But I think if stable coins are going to have extensive use, these are issues that have to be addressed and have to be tackled. So that's, I can pick up any more, but that's just a high-level introduction, Aaron.
Yeah, that's, and that's really helpful, because oftentimes when we're in the US, we also get very myopic and only think about our own jurisdiction. So it's good for you to help broaden our perspective so we can learn from other, global partners. Having said that, maybe kind of understanding kind of the European landscape, as you mentioned, Nigel, kind of looking a little bit closer to home. As Aaron mentioned, the last quarter was amazing for stablecoins in terms of their growth and proliferation, but it was also quite an eventful quarter in terms of the regulators really leaning in and starting to weigh in. And I think we can all acknowledge, and we have, that the future scale and sustainability of stablecoins is intertwined to the actions of the regulators. So in the US, when you take a look at what the OCC and the SEC have opined on, what does that tell you in terms of the future trajectory and sustainability? And Nick, maybe if I can start with you to weigh in, and then Nigel, would love to kind of get your follow-up perspective as, in looking at it from a European vantage point.
Well, I think the big open question is what we'll have. That's the elephant in the room. That's $16 billion held in offshore banks, unclear which banks they are. And we know the, NYAG has been trying to sort of reckon with them for a while and trying to apply pressure to them, but it's not clear what's going to happen there. If that does happen, if something adverse happens to Tether, that's a systemic event for the entire crypto industry, because so much of the exchange environment is denominated and settled in Tethers. The other big outstanding question for me is, what are the legal assurances of a transaction that you would make with a US domiciled fiat convertible stablecoin like USDC? If you look at their terms of service, it's actually, they admit that there's still open legal questions as to what the quality of settlement is and the enforceability of those transactions. And then there's this notion of whether the privacy model of stablecoins can persist. Issuers don't really have knowledge of every transaction that happens on a P2P network. They have knowledge of their counterparties who are creating and redeeming stablecoins. They don't have knowledge of every peer-to-peer transaction, even if it is with their coin. Can that much more open model persist? That's kind of the really big outstanding question for me.
And I think privacy is definitely one that's gaining a lot of dominance, including comments today from Chairman Jerome Powell. Now, he was talking about CBDCs and US not so much doing it first, but doing it right. And privacy was something he spoke about at length. Nigel, maybe a more pointed question, because we're up to time and I want to give Aaron time to close, is do you see future regulation driven by collaboration with industry or more so driven by enforcement?
I think regulation, what will happen in terms of regulation is there will be continued work by the regulators to try and provide reassurance that they are on the top of what the particular risks are. So the risks here that we've discussed are is the relationship governable? Is there appropriate data information? Is there appropriate clarity? Some of the issues that we've been talking around today are hitting some challenges if you look against the high-level principles which have been set out by the FSB. I think the high-level principles by the FSB will be the guiding. will be the guiding force, and I think there will be quite a bit of regulatory activity by national regulators trying to translate those regulatory principles into actual frameworks. And I think that is what's going to happen at the high level regulation. Then at the level of individual actions, that will be for the national regulators with individual cases, and I'm not going to talk about that.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Over to you.
And just really quick, I'm going to turn over to Alex here, and then we'll wrap it up here. But Alex, so a couple of months ago, you wrote an op-ed in Coindesk arguing that the only way for stablecoins to really achieve mass adoption is for them to effectively sever their connection to the banks or decouple from banks essentially as collateral holders, and then find a compliant way of keeping collateral outside of the banking system. Maybe in 60 seconds or so, can you kind of summarize your argument there as far as why you think that's necessary and why it's challenging?
This environment changes fast, but I keep my views, at least, for a period of 2 or 3 months. So my opinion right now is the same as it was in this paper. I really think that we underappreciate the instability of the banking system itself. The idea that you have an analog or equivalent of fiat currency backed by banking reserves, to my mind, doesn't make much sense, because even the best of the banks are still having, maybe 1% probability of default per year, which is not small at all, right? So from that perspective, I think that either creation of specially oriented narrow banks, something which I entertained for a little while, leaving Bank of America, but was never given a get-go by the Fed and stuff like that. But simpler versions, including potentially broker dealers and other organizations which can actually hold collateral backed by short-dated government paper and held to maturity, and other vehicles of that nature seem to be a much better solution to the problem. Not to mention the other thing which is constantly forgotten in all these discussions, and the only reason why it is forgotten is because the sliver of stable coins, however fast it grows, is still minuscule in the big picture of things. So the other thing is that if one were to keep the collateral with the banking system, then there would be 2 sources of payment tokens in the system simultaneously, which will increase the inflation rate, overall, which is an Achilles heel of schemas like Libra, for example, and in fact unsurmountable in their way of thinking about it. So in summary, in the remaining 6 seconds, I can say, yes, we need to do our utmost to find ways of keeping collateral outside of the existing banking system in a legally, regulatory compliant fashion.
There will be securities. Sorry, just wanted to say that in that model they would be securities.
Well, rather nuanced, and maybe we can discuss it offline, given that we have negative 2 minutes to continue.
All right, guys. Well, thanks, Fenny, Nick, Nigel, Alex, Sunena, and special thanks to Chris for hosting us today. And we'll turn it back to you guys, Chris.
Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Lee Reiners, and I'm the Executive Director of the Global Financial Market Center at Duke Law. At Duke, I teach a class titled Fintech Law and Policy, and I begin the course module on cryptocurrency by asking my students to define money. Those who have taken an undergraduate economics course typically offer the standard economist definition that money is a unit of account, store of value, and medium of exchange. This is a definition according to the functions money performs, but it fails to explain what money is. In my paper, Cryptocurrency and the State, an Unholy Alliance, I explain the essence of money and contextualize the rise of cryptocurrency within the historical relationship between money and the state. The anthropological record is clear. Money is fundamentally a social technology that allows for the measurement of debt. This is known as the credit theory of money, and I provide a concrete example in my paper. But if currency is simply anything that is used to clear credit accounts, How do you trust that a specific currency will be accepted? Enter the state, who has always had a vested interest in standardizing units of measurement within their borders. Because all citizens must pay taxes and thus share a common creditor, government-issued tokens can freely circulate as currency within the community. People are willing to accept these tokens as payment because they know they can use them to pay their obligations to the state. Thus, the state's role in money's creation is essential. Now, history does offer examples of privately issued token-based money, but such money only works in close-knit societies where transacting parties know each other's creditworthiness. Cryptocurrency attempts to solve the geographic limitations of previous forms of token-based money by representing a new form of community that is made possible by the internet. However, cryptocurrency does not fit neatly within the credit theory of money because there is no underlying debtor. When you spend a Bitcoin, whose obligation does this represent? Bitcoins are not issued. They are created using computer code, and they exist as computer code. If there is no issuer, then who or what are Bitcoin users trusting? Satoshi understood the central role of trust in sustaining private currencies, which is why the words trust or trusted appear 13 times in the Bitcoin white paper. Rather than trust a third party, Bitcoin's revelation was its underlying blockchain technology that allows network participants to trust the information recorded on a shared ledger without trusting anyone to validate it. Despite this new form of trust, Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies have yet to meaningfully challenge fiat currency in fulfilling the three functions of money. This is partially due to design reasons and partially due to the continued hold of the nation state as principal architect of social trust. As the origin of money demonstrates, the surest way to accelerate greater use of any currency is to grant it legal tender status. But why would a state relinquish the benefits of its monopoly over legal tender? For this reason, no country recognizes Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency as legal tender, although several countries have passed laws that facilitate greater use of cryptocurrency. In my paper, I describe how US agency interpretations are largely premised on the historical reality that currency is the domain of the sovereign, and that this definition could possibly undermine cryptocurrency regulations should any sovereign adopt cryptocurrency as legal tender. This wasn't much of a concern until Facebook announced plans for Libra in the summer of 2019. Due to Facebook's scale, Libra was the first real threat to sovereign currencies. When the head of Libra testified on Capitol Hill shortly after the project's launch, he noted that the primary benefit for Facebook was the ability to drive more commerce on the platform. And if there's more commerce, there's more advertising revenue. Just as the state utilized its status as common creditor to create and circulate sovereign money, Facebook would tap its unique role as a global online community and marketplace to introduce a native, borderless currency. Facebook may not be a common creditor, but it is a common platform. Libra exposed the fragmented nature of cryptocurrency regulation in the US. As policymakers sift through and debate proposals to clarify and streamline cryptocurrency regulation, it's important they keep in mind the relationship between sovereignty and money. Unfortunately, recent guidance from the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency that allows national banks to custody crypto assets and hold stablecoin reserves threatens to undermine the dollar's status by accommodating the use of cryptocurrency in the banking sector. The acting comptroller's support for stablecoins is premised on an understandable desire to speed up the settlement process for dollar-based transactions. The problem with this logic is that it evaluates currency through a technological prism, as opposed to looking at the qualities of the state standing behind the currency. If superior technology is the goal, it only makes sense to allow technology companies to issue and circulate currency. But as with Libra, even if a stablecoin is backed exclusively by dollars, the linkage becomes irrelevant the more the stablecoin is used. This process is what allowed the US to gradually decouple the dollar from gold and may allow a future Google coin or Amazon coin to ditch the dollar. This would, of course, make these companies even bigger and more powerful, which is something that should concern us all. I encourage you to find out more in my paper. Thank you.
Well, against the conversation on cryptocurrencies and the state, I'm very happy and delighted to welcome Heath Tarbert back to FinTech Week. Now, Heath Tarbert is the chairman of the CFTC, and like many of our speakers, works quite literally at the intersection of issues relating to the soundness and safety of new digital infrastructures. And when you look at the CFTC's particular spate or regulatory perimeter, it is indeed covering a number of cryptocurrencies and digital assets, and or indirectly, and in some instances more directly. And as a result, his views and his decisions are really critical to understanding what happens in the United States and in our markets. So with that, Mr. Chairman, Heath, thank you so very, very much for joining us again at FinTech Week. We've always really appreciated the CFTC and obviously your support.
Great to be here, Chris. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, you know, there was a really interesting conversation in the previous panel on stable coins. And obviously that conversation was even brought up in some way in our flash presentation from Lee. Do you have any thoughts on stable coins? Just given the fact that you have a lot of experience, not just over at the CFTC, but even from your days over in the Treasury Department. I mean, what has struck you when you're even thinking about stable coins from a regulatory standpoint about stable coins and the like as alternatives to money?
Yeah, great question. And as the last panel and the videos show, it raises many more questions than that. And so obviously, you know, personally, my view is I find it fascinating. I'm always interested in financial innovations, but obviously they have to be responsible innovations. And so that's really the question when we look at things like stablecoin is how would they work? What kind of benefits would they bring? But also, what are the potential downsides? And can those downsides be properly mitigated? So obviously, there's always a question when you come from the Treasury Department as to KYC and AML requirements. So obviously, we have gone to great lengths in the wake of September 11th, which now is close to 20 years ago. But we really have a very tightened regime to combat terrorist financing and money laundering. And there's a real question, obviously, that if stable coins come to the fore, just with digital currencies more generally, that we could lose some of that. So that's always a threshold issue. But stable coins in particular raise a lot more issues. There's the issue, of course, of what do you do? What are the assets, the reserves that are held against the stable coin, and how would that work? What about redemption rights? And so it starts to look more, you know, some could argue analogous to a money market fund of some sort. And then you have the link between a stable coin and a particular currency, and some of these were raised in the last presentation, and particularly the video about, well, what's the relationship there between the sovereign? Will there be a situation where, you know, the sovereign will effectively lose control over monetary policy? So those would be kind of the regulatory issues. I think there's also a host of practical issues as well. So for example, how useful is a stable coin if you're a retail investor? If it's linked to a particular currency, wouldn't it be better just simply to have a central bank digital currency, which is another topic of discussion, or a faster payment system, you know? And there's a metaphysical question there. What's the difference between a central bank digital currency and just a faster payment system where there's an electric representation of a dollar, for example? And then ultimately, if you have a stable coin, but it's tied to a central bank currency, which itself could be devalued, if you're looking for a store of value, is that really where you want to go anyway? Or do you want something more like a Bitcoin, which you know represents arguably a store of value that is much more limited? It can't be replicated, and it can't be subject to inflationary policies of a central bank. So those are all the sorts of regulatory or at least some of them regulatory and practical questions, I think.
Well, you know, the viewers from DC FinTech Week today now have heard both metaphysics being referred to. We also had from John Cunliffe the Book of Genesis being evoked to understand central bank digital currencies. So we are truly an interdisciplinary conference for sure. You know, one of the parts or one of the more challenging aspects, obviously, that we have sort of thought through and that you've been thinking through is, whenever you have that novel digital asset, that novel crypto asset, is how do you go about the case of classifying them? And Brad Garlinghouse was on a little bit earlier. He was making a statement about just the general complexity of the regulatory environment and sort of making guesses, if one will, about different crypto assets and how do you identify its whether or not it's a money market-esque instrument or a security. But stable coins, it's really, that's highly an interesting space because the way that they operate, it can be diverse, but they would also presumably have to go through the scrutiny as well as to whether or not there is a security and sort of fall under the ambit of the SEC or whether or not and how and to what degree the CFTC would become an important player. How do you, when you think about that particular regulatory question, is there an assumption that many of these stable coins could, particularly if there were different contracts written that reference them, but do you think that we're entering more and more into CFTC land as stable coins become so important and as their popularity grows really exponentially in many of these markets?
Well, just like a law professor would say, it depends, of course, on
that was quite good.
How it is structured, of course. And the interesting thing is, I guess this area is very confusing. And unless you're an expert like yourself, for many people watching out there, they're saying, well, how, can you break this down? And so the way that I basically say it is, putting aside the question of whether indeed it is legal tender, which I think would put it in a different category, the real question every time we see a particular digital asset is it a security, number one? And if so, the SEC has exclusive jurisdiction. If no, then is it a commodity, number two? In which case the CFTC doesn't have regulatory jurisdiction, but we have fraud and manipulation authority. And then third, is it a derivative on a commodity, in which case we both have fraud and manipulation authority, but we regulate it as well. The definition of commodity is really broad. So many things are in fact commodities. So unless it's actually legal tender and something very different, every digital asset is likely to be a commodity. But if it's also a security, it gets kicked out of our jurisdiction into the SEC's jurisdiction. So Bitcoin and Ether, for example, are commodities. We don't directly regulate them. We regulate derivatives on them, but we also regulate, we also can bring enforcement actions if there's fraud and manipulation. Now, stable coins are interesting because you got something underlying the coin. So it is theoretically possible that the relationship between the actual asset and the underlying is a derivative. And so you could actually have that third category where we regulate them directly. But it's all going to depend on how individual stable coins are structured.
Do you think that the CFTC, and this is obviously a question that could go to any regulator depending on the particular crypto asset that's in their backyard, but assuming that you do have a continued growth of stable coins, or derivative instruments that reference them, just as you do in many sort of fiat currency markets. I mean, does the SEC or does the CFTC have the tools in place, in your view, to really grapple with this new financial instrument that is going to obviously impact a number of markets, some more nascent than others?
Well, we're building those tools right now, Chris. So I'd say that we have committed to making innovation at the forefront of the CFTC and done a number of things in those areas, including elevating Lab CFTC to report directly to the chairman. And now Lab CFTC has a role alongside the other divisions, which is really important. We've also gone to great lengths to clarify our view on certain digital assets with certain advice that we gave just months ago. And we also have the two biggest classes of digital assets currently out there, Bitcoin and Ether, under our jurisdiction. and we have derivatives products trading on them. And so we are building out or seeking to build out a regime where digital assets can be treated holistically under the Commodity Exchange Act.
You'd also mentioned CBDCs, and we had a wonderful, as I'd mentioned, a wonderful panel earlier in the day. But I'm really interested for your perspective. I mean, does the CBDC project excite or scare you? I mean, your observations at the outset were very insightful. But how do you view that as potentially impacting your work over at the CFTC? I mean, do you envision that conversation to have relevance for the CFTC? Or is this something that you see as really the province of maybe our banking regulators?
Well, I think the creation of it, certainly. So the initial question is, am I excited or scared? And I would say overall, I'm excited. The only thing that scares me is if the United States falls behind. So I definitely think, given that something like 20% of the world's central banks, particularly the advanced economies, even more so, are working on central bank digital currencies, I think it's encouraging that the Fed is working on it as well. And the United States needs to continue to lead in this area as we lead on most areas of innovation. It is really the province of the Federal Reserve, I think, in terms of creating this currency, certainly for the US dollar. And I'm pleased with what I hear, their collaboration with MIT, for example, in making this happen. I think it's really important that they work with the private sector. The government can do a lot of things, but I think if we were able to harness American innovation to help continue to propel the project forward, my guess is it'll get finished quicker, just like we did when we went to the moon back in 1969. So for us, it would enter our space. We wouldn't be directly, but you could see other central bank digital assets, for example, central bank digital currencies emerging. And because we do have some regulation of certain types of futures and things in the foreign exchange world, our jurisdiction would certainly be implicated at some point.
Interesting. Again, just continuing the international line of our conversation a little bit further. I mean, what do you, and I should say even broadening things out, not just for the crypto space, but also internationally. You've been busy, but what have you seen and what are you thinking about a lot of the regulatory initiatives overseas, and how do you think international collaboration and coordination should be looking like, especially when you think about the more cutting edge issues?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Chris, and it's far more important now in the digital age than ever before. I mean, financial products themselves and financial markets rarely look at borders and jurisdictions among regulators. But that's all the more true when we're talking about things like digital assets. And so coming up with standards, with shared standards in IOSCO, for example, that's a critical project. The Financial Stability Board is working on it. And so I think in order to have a regime, particularly if we start to see the emergence of a global stablecoin, it has to be internationally coordinated. So we've been working on this now for several years with our international counterparts on sort of what should be the regulatory framework. And then more generally, it's really important that regulators talk to each other and share with each other. We have innovation partnerships with a number of regulators around the world, and we're looking to expand that. I would love, for example, to do something with South Africa, which is sort of the leading financial center for the largest continent in the world. And so stay tuned, for potential announcements on that and other fronts.
Great. I will stay tuned. Interesting. I guess, when you look at then, your to-do list and some of the biggest outstanding questions, particularly in crypto sort of oversight, I mean, is there one particular area or issue that either keeps you up at night or you think that deserves more attention, particularly in the next sort of 12 months, whether or not it be smart contracts or some other aspect of infrastructure for crypto assets?
Yeah, I would say there are two buckets of sort of two categories of things that I think we need to focus on as regulators in the next couple of years. The first is one that you mentioned at the outset and other speakers have mentioned, which is the need for certainty, for regulatory certainty and clarity. Clarity is one of the agency's 4 values. We think it's absolutely critical that we provide the market as much clarity as we can on what's a security, what's a commodity. And so we really want to work on that over the next couple of years, obviously hand in hand with other regulators like the SEC. The other big category that concerns me is we want to encourage innovation, responsible innovation. We want these markets to grow and thrive, but that means they need to be free from fraud and manipulation. And obviously in the crypto space, we're seeing some bad actors come in, and my concern is that they will come in and they will undermine not only the products, but the public's confidence in the products, and it could lead to a backlash. And so we are going after particular actors, for example, who try to manipulate. And many of our derivatives contracts, for example, the CME's benchmark indices is based on information from various crypto exchanges. So we need to make sure that they're reported with great integrity. And so we're watching out for those things. We're also watching out for offshore exchanges that are effectively offering derivatives products to U.S. investors that aren't registered with us as a registered designated contract market. So you see, we've brought a case, for example, along those lines very recently. So those would be the things that we're really focused on.
Bringing things a little bit closer to home. I've been pretty active thinking about diversity in our regulatory agencies and the importance of it and what it means for our nation's agencies and the work that they do. And I know you've been thinking about it for some time. And maybe you could share your perspective. I mean, I know it's a conversation that's been picking up momentum here in Washington, D.C. and really around the world. And I'd just be interested to know what you're thinking about it and how the CFTC itself is thinking about making sure that our regulatory policies reflect, I guess, the larger ambit of Americans in our financial system.
Yeah, no, a fantastic question, and I want to thank you for your research in this area. So, taking the issue of the effective policies, we came up with a set of 5 strategic goals, and one of those goals is in everything we do, ensuring that the derivatives markets work for all Americans. And so we ask that question every time we do a major rulemaking. As far as diversity, more specifically in the agency, when I came to the agency 15 months ago, I tried to make very clear that diversity makes us stronger as an agency. So we have the most diverse executive team that I think we've had in CFTC history, but most importantly, across the agency, we have more women now serving in more leadership positions than ever before. But that said, 45 years is a long time, and federal agencies, changing them overnight is somewhat difficult. And one of the things in particular, your research is focused on African Americans. One of the reasons I think we don't see them in a number of leadership positions within the agency, let's say career policy post, is because many of the people holding those positions now have 10 to 20 years of experience. So there's really a pipeline issue. So that's something that we've focused on at the CFTC, is giving opportunities to, in particular, people of color, African Americans, so they can really take a leading role. So for example, in our position limits rulemaking, you saw presenters who were people of color, other types of major rulemakings. And these are the people that aren't necessarily leaders of the CFTC career staff today, but they will be tomorrow. And that's really important. The other thing I'll mention is that when you look at some of our key offices, so Lab CFTC, which has been so critical in working with you in putting this, doing some of the things this week, as well as the Office of International Affairs, each of them is over 70% women and minority. So really, these are the training grounds for the people that are talking to Silicon Valley, working on cutting issues, negotiating with foreign countries, and they're more diverse than the agency as a whole. But your overarching point, I think, in your paper is really important, and that's that at the very top of the leadership chain, at the chairman, the commissioners of these institutions, we don't have particularly African-American representation, and I think I'm hopeful that will change in future years. And Chris, I can't help but say, when I think who would make an outstanding future SEC or CFTC chairman, that there's very few people other on that list than you. You have a tremendous background, you know about these issues, and you're forward thinking. So So I know you would be missed at Georgetown, but I do hope that in the future, you would be a candidate for these top roles.
Thank you so much, Chairman. I really do appreciate that. And I appreciate also just the time that you've been putting into this conversation and for joining us all. That's very kind of you, very, very kind of you. Okay, so we're about to now take a quick break, but we will be back in a few. Thank you again. The CFTC has been with FinTech Week as well since the very beginning. And it's always a delight to have the CFTC and the chairman with us. And we will be having another event later on with Lab CFTC, a little bit of instruction for companies who demo their tech with regulators. And we'll be talking about that a little bit later. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I guess that's the end for our DC FinTech Week. Guys, day one over. Can't wait to recheck the Brad Garlinghouse interview, Brian Brooks interview, Christopher Giancarlo panel, Digital Dollar Project. But thank you to everybody who tuned in. I can't believe it. 35 likes, 13 viewers still. You guys are awesome, man. Thanks to the Blue Crew. Shout out to the Blue Crew. Shout out to everybody who joined this stream for the first time and any new subscribers. Thank you so much. Much love to everybody. I'll see you guys soon. Alrighty. Adios.